Horace Vane didn't lower his voice when he said it. That was the part people remembered later, not just what he said, but that he said it loud, in the middle of Main Street, with half of Copper Hollow watching. Someone needs to remove that woman before she embarrasses this town further. He was pointing at Nora Bellamy. She was sitting outside the general store on an upturned crate, needle in hand, mending a blanket so worn through you could read scripture through the holes. She hadn't spoken to anyone. She hadn't asked for anything. She was just there, which, in Horace Vane's estimation, was apparently crime enough. Nobody moved to stop him. Nobody said a word. And Gideon Rourke, the wealthiest man in the Wyoming Territory, a man who had faced down cattle thieves, droughts, and territorial judges, stood on that sidewalk and said absolutely nothing. Then his 7-year-old daughter let go of his hand. If you've ever watched someone be humiliated in public while everyone around them looked away, if you've ever been that person, or the one doing the looking, then you already know exactly what this story is about. Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to something in your heart, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if it moves you, hit that like button. It helps more people find their way here. Now let's go back to Copper Hollow, Wyoming, 1881. The summer of 1881 arrived in Copper Hollow like an uninvited guest who didn't know when to leave. By July, the heat had baked the main street clay into something that cracked underfoot, and the air smelled of cattle dust and scorched lumber from the railroad expansion 3 miles east. It was the kind of heat that made men short-tempered and women strategic. It was the kind of heat that reminded everyone how far they were from anywhere that mattered. Gideon Rourke had lived in Copper Hollow long enough to stop noticing the heat. He had also, if he was honest with himself, stopped noticing quite a few other things. He was 41 years old, broad through the shoulders with hands that bore the old calluses of working land before he had enough money to pay other men to work it for him. His hair had gone silver at the temples in the 2 years since Margaret died, and there were mornings he caught himself looking in the shaving mirror and not recognizing the man looking back. Not because he had aged so dramatically, but because he had expected grief to look different on a person. He had expected it to be visible somehow, a wound you could point to. Instead, it settled somewhere behind his sternum and stayed there, quiet and permanent, like a stone he had simply learned to carry. He told himself he was fine. He told everyone else the same thing. Elsie knew better. Elsie had always known better. She was 7 years old, with Margaret's dark eyes and Gideon's stubborn chin, and for 2 years she had not said a single word. Not one. Physicians from Cheyenne had come to the ranch and gone home mystified. One had suggested she was simple. Gideon had asked that man to leave before he did something he'd regret. Another had recommended a special school in Denver, a place Gideon had visited once briefly and come home from without Elsie, unable to explain to anyone, including himself, why he couldn't leave her there. Something about the way the other children sat in rows looking at nothing had reminded him too much of the way Elsie had looked at Margaret's empty chair at the supper table, like the world had simply run out of things worth seeing. He had brought her home. He had hired tutors. He had purchased the most beautiful dolls available by catalog, 3 of them, each one costing more than a ranch hand earned in a month. Elsie had looked at those dolls for a long moment, then set them carefully on the shelf and gone back to sitting by the window. That was Elsie's life, sitting by windows, walking beside Gideon in complete silence, watching the world the way other children watched through glass at a candy shop, aware that something sweet existed somewhere, but uncertain whether it was meant for her. Gideon had stopped trying to understand it. That was his way. With things he couldn't fix, he worked around them. He managed them. He built walls. He was very good at building walls. They had come to town that Tuesday morning because Gideon had business with the bank. Something about the Henderson parcel on the North Range, and because the household had run low on salt pork and lamp oil, and because he had told himself, standing at the breakfast table watching Elsie push eggs around her plate, that fresh air would do her good. That maybe seeing other people, hearing the noise of a real town, would wake something in her that the ranch couldn't reach. She had walked beside him down the main street with her hand tucked in his quiet, as always, eyes moving carefully from face to face like she was reading something the rest of the world had written in a language only she could almost understand. He hadn't noticed Nora Bellamy until Horace Vane made sure everyone did. Horace Vane was the kind of man who had never personally done anything terrible, which was precisely what made him so effective at it. He owned the feed merchant operation, sat on the town council, and had an opinion about everything in the social position to deliver those opinions at volume. His wife, Cecilia, matched him inch for inch in respectability and a few inches beyond in cruelty, which she delivered with the particular refinement of someone who understood that the most damaging insults arrived wrapped in concerned tones. Vane had been walking out of the barber shop when he spotted Nora sitting there outside Caldwell's general store, and something in him had simply decided that Tuesday morning was the moment to address the situation. Someone needs to remove that woman before she embarrasses this town further. He said it to the three men standing nearest him, but he said it at a pitch that carried. Nora didn't look up from her sewing. That somehow seemed to make it worse. Gideon was 15 feet away, close enough to hear every word, and he felt the familiar pull of the calculation he'd been making. His whole adult life in situations like this, how much does this matter versus how much will it cost me to say something? He was not a cruel man. He had never understood cruelty as a personality trait, but he had built his empire on relationships, on not burning bridges before he'd crossed them, on knowing which fights were worth picking and which were not. Nora Bellamy was not his business. He had never spoken to her. He knew the outline of her situation the way you know. The outline of anyone's situation in a small town, the husband dead, the homestead gone, creditors who had taken the equipment and the mule, and apparently the last shred of goodwill the town had left to offer. He knew she had been sleeping in the back room of the church hall, that Mrs. Caldwell let her sew repair work in exchange for a small wage, most of its windows were dark, and that the better families of Copper Hollow had adopted the silent collective agreement that the most merciful thing they could do for Nora Bellamy was to pretend she didn't quite exist. He had been doing his part. He was very good at pretending people didn't exist. He looked down at Elsie to move her along. Elsie wasn't there. For one fractured second, pure animal panic shot through him the way it always did when he looked for her, and she wasn't where she was supposed to be, that particular terror that belonged specifically to a parent who had already lost one person and couldn't construct, in that split second, any universe in which losing another one was survivable. Then he saw her. She was crossing the street, alone, walking through the rutted dust of the main thoroughfare with the kind of absolute purposefulness that 7-year-old children have when they've decided something, when no adult logic has yet had a chance to intervene and complicate their certainty. She wasn't running. She was walking like she was following something she couldn't see, some thread pulled taut between her chest and whatever she was moving toward Nora Bellamy. Gideon started after her. He had already shaped the apology in his mouth. Sorry. She doesn't mean any harm. She doesn't really understand, already preparing to scoop Elsie up and redirect the situation before it became a scene, before Horace Vane could add it to the list of things to use against him. He didn't make it in time. Elsie reached Nora, stopped directly in front of her, and looked at her for a moment the way she looked at things, with that particular underwater stillness. And then she did something she hadn't done to a single person, not Gideon, not the housekeepers, not the tutors, not one soul in 2 years. She put her arms out, and she walked forward, and she buried her face in Nora Bellamy's side and held on. Nora froze. The needle stopped. Her hands hovered in the air for a moment, uncertain, like a woman who had been handed something precious and was afraid of what would happen if she breathed. Then slowly, as though she'd been given permission by something she couldn't name either, she folded her arms around this child she had never met and held her back. Gideon stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the street and he just stopped. He would never be able to explain afterward what happened in his chest in that moment. He was not a sentimental man. He did not traffic in scenes or weeping. But something in the way Elsie was holding that woman, the way she had walked across a public street in front of Horace Vane and the barbers and the bankers' wives and every disapproving eye in Copper Hollow to hold a woman the whole town had, decided to discard something in that rearranged him. Just slightly. Just enough. The street had gone very quiet. Even Vane had stopped talking. Then, against the stillness of it, so soft that Gideon almost didn't catch it, he heard something he had not heard in 2 years. A voice. Elsie's voice, one warm. Not a hello. Not a question. Not one of the words the tutors had tried for months to coax out of her with patience and treats and patient, gentle pressure. Not daddy or please or thank you. Just that one strange, simple declaration, spoken into the worn fabric of a widow's patched dress, in a voice so small it barely disturbed the summer air. Warm. Gideon stood there and felt something crack open in him, not painfully, but the way ice gives way at the end of a long winter. Slow and irreversible, and accompanied by a sound only he could hear. He walked across the rest of that street like a man in a dream. When he reached them, Nora was looking up at him over Else's head with an expression that wasn't pity, and wasn't discomfort, and wasn't the careful social blankness that most people arranged their faces into when Elsie's silence became apparent to them. It was something quieter than all of that. Something older. Recognition, maybe. The look of a person who had also learned what it was to be somewhere and have nobody see you. She's yours? Nora asked. Her voice was steadier than he'd expected. He didn't know what he'd expected. Embarrassment, maybe. The hunched posture of someone accustomed to being a problem. Instead, she met his eyes directly, and Elsie hadn't let go of her. And Gideon found that every paired thing he'd been about to say had just walked off and left him standing there with nothing. Yes, he said. That was all he managed. She's cold, Nora said, which made no sense given the heat, and then she reached down and adjusted the thin cotton of Elsie's collar, where it had rucked up against her neck, a motion so instinctive, so mother-like, that Gideon had to look away for a moment. Elsie, he crouched down to his daughter's level. Elsie, sweetheart, Elsie tightened her hold on Nora. Gideon looked up. From 15 feet away, Horace Vane was watching with his arms crossed and an expression that managed to communicate, without a single word, that he was cataloging this moment for later use. Cecilia Vane had appeared from somewhere and was leaning toward her husband's ear. The Barbers had come to their doorway. Mrs. Caldwell was watching through the window of the general store. All of them. Watching. And Gideon looked at each of their faces one by one, and then looked back at his daughter who hadn't spoken in 2 years and was currently using both arms to cling to the woman they'd all decided to make invisible. He made a calculation. It was a different kind of calculation than the one he usually made. Miss Bellamy, he said. He straightened up. I recognize this is an unusual request. But would you be willing to walk with us? Just for a little while. Nora considered him. Not his money, not his reputation, not the audience currently watching from the sidewalks. She looked at him the way she'd looked at Elsie, that same steady measuring quality, like she was reading something beneath the surface words. Where, she said. It was such a practical question. He liked it immediately. Wherever Elsie wants to go, he said. They walked for an hour. Elsie led them without any apparent destination in mind, the way children do when the point isn't the destination, but the movement through the side streets, behind the feed merchant, along the creek bank, where the cottonwoods gave some shade from the mid-morning sun, past the old schoolhouse, and back toward the edge of town, where the rail workers' families had their settlement of canvas tents and rough lumber shacks. Elsie held Nora's hand the whole way. She didn't speak again, but she also didn't need to. There was something different about her silence, now lighter. Somehow, like the difference between a room with no windows and a room with the windows simply closed. The possibility of air. Gideon watched her from the corner of his eye and felt something shift in his understanding of the last 2 years, though he couldn't yet have said what. Nora walked without the hunched quality he'd half expected. She talked to Elsie the way very few adults talk to silent children, not over her, not about her, not in that loud, simplified register people adopted, when they were uncertain whether understanding was present. She just talked, about small things, the sound the creek made, the way the cottonwood fluff had been coming down all week, thick as snow. Whether Elsie thought the clouds to the west were real rain clouds, or just the kind that looked promising and turned out to be nothing. Elsie listened. And once she pressed Nora's hand, twice in quick succession, which Nora took as an answer to one of her questions and responded to accordingly. And Gideon had to stop walking for a moment, pretending to look at something in the near distance, because he didn't want either of them to see his face. When they finally circled back toward the main street, the heat had pushed past 11 o'clock, and the dust was rising, with the foot traffic of mid-morning. Nora said she should get back. She had more mending to finish, and Mrs. Caldwell was generous about the workspace, but not infinitely patient. Gideon said, "I'd like to offer you a position." Nora stopped. Elsie stopped with her, still holding her hand, and looked at Gideon with those dark eyes that always made him feel like she was reading the draft of whatever he was about to say before he said it. "What kind of position?" Nora said. "Not a question exactly. Careful threshold." "At the ranch," Gideon said. "Working with Elsie. We have a full household staff, it wouldn't be. I want to be clear. This would be a position with a proper wage." Not charity," Nora said. "No," he said. "Not charity." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at Elsie, and Elsie looked back up at her with those quiet, fathomless eyes, and Nora took a breath and said something that surprised him. "I have one condition," she said. He had expected negotiation on the wage, maybe on the duties. He hadn't expected conditions. "All right," he said. "If I come to work for you, I work," Nora said. "I earn what I'm given. I don't sit at your table out of pity. And I don't accept gifts that aren't wages, and I don't become a story people tell about Gideon Rourke's generosity." She met his eyes without flinching. "I have had enough of being someone else's story." The directness of it stopped him for a moment. He thought of his wife, briefly of Margaret, who had told him the truth of things with precisely that same quality, a refusal to let comfort be purchased at the price of honesty. He thought of the tutors he had hired who smiled too easily, physicians who had nodded too quickly. "Agreed," he said. "Then I'll come," Nora said. Elsie made a sound. Very small. Not quite a word. But it was the second sound in 2 years. They rode back out to the ranch that afternoon, Gideon driving the wagon, Nora sitting across from him, Elsie between them with her shoulder pressing warm against Nora's arm, asleep before they'd made it half a mile out of town. Gideon drove and didn't talk much. He was thinking about Horace Vane's face on that sidewalk. He was thinking about Nora's condition. He was thinking about the word warm, about the way Elsie had walked across that street with such complete conviction, as though she had seen something the rest of them had missed. He was also thinking, though he wouldn't have admitted it, he had no idea what he was doing. He had spent 2 years applying money to every problem and watching each solution fail to reach whatever was actually broken. He had hired the best people, and bought the best things, and maintained the best appearances, and his daughter had remained somewhere behind glass, somewhere none of it could touch. And then a woman with a patched blanket and worn shoes and nothing left to lose had held her for 5 minutes. He didn't understand it. He was a man who needed to understand things, who felt safest when the variables were known and the outcomes calculable. Nora Bellamy was neither known nor calculable. He glanced at her once, briefly, as the wagon moved through the long afternoon light. She was looking at the landscape with an expression that was hard to read, not afraid, not resentful, not performing gratitude, just looking. The way someone looks at a thing they might stay with for a while, still deciding whether to trust it. He looked back at the road. The sun was dropping behind the western ridge, pulling the shadows long across the grass, and somewhere overhead a hawk was circling against the last of the blue sky, and Elsie slept between them with her face finally, improbably at rest. Gideon Rourke drove his wagon toward home. He didn't know yet what was coming. He didn't know about Vane's campaign to drive Nora out, about the fever that would descend on the railroad settlement like judgment, about the night the storm would come, and he would have to decide what, exactly, he was willing to lose. He didn't know any of that yet. He just knew that something had changed that morning on Main Street. And whatever wall he'd been building since Margaret died, the careful, efficient, well-managed wall had developed, for the first time in 2 years, a crack, and the light was getting in. The first morning Nora Bellamy woke up in the Rourke ranch house, she lay still for a full minute before opening her eyes. She had spent the previous 14 months sleeping on a cot in the back room of the church hall where the roof leaked in 2 places, and the mice had understood that the space was shared and conducted themselves accordingly. Before that, she and Caleb had slept in the homestead they'd built with their own hands, in a bed she'd sewn the mattress for, in a room that smelled like sawdust, and the lavender she'd dried from the small garden out front. She had stopped thinking about that room deliberately, The way you stop pressing a bruise once you understand that pressing it doesn't help. The room she was in now had a real mattress and a window facing east and curtains that someone had ironed. It was smaller than the guest rooms she'd glimpsed down the hall. She suspected Mrs. Aldridge, the housekeeper, had put her here deliberately, near the back stairs, adjacent to Elsie's room, in a location that split the difference between staff quarters and something better without committing to either. Nora didn't mind. She had slept in worse places with better attitudes about it. She opened her eyes. The ceiling was plain whitewashed plaster. The morning light came through the eastern window at a low angle and put a rectangle of gold across the floorboards. She got up, dressed without lighting the lamp, and went to find where they kept the coffee. Mrs. Aldridge was already in the kitchen when Nora arrived. She was a compact woman in her 50s, with iron-gray hair pinned back with a ruthless precision that suggested she applied the same standard to everything in her life. She had been running the Rourke household for 11 years, which meant she had been there before Margaret died, which meant she had watched Elsie change, which meant she had feelings about Nora's presence that she was too professional to express and too human to hide entirely. She looked up when Nora came in. "Coffee's on," she said. "Thank you," Nora said. A pause, the specific kind that wasn't quite silence because it was too full of unspoken things. "Mr. Rourke takes his breakfast at 6, Mrs. Aldridge said. "Elsie usually isn't up until 7. The arrangement was that you'd work with Elsie mornings and afternoons. I wasn't given specifics beyond that." "Neither was I," Nora said. Mrs. Aldridge looked at her then, a real look, assessing. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone softer," she said. "The way he described it, I thought never mind." She turned back to the stove. "There's bread from yesterday. Help yourself." Nora helped herself and sat at the kitchen table and drank her coffee in the early quiet of the house, listening to it wake up around her. Creak of a board upstairs. A door. Then, very faint, the sound of small feet in the hallway above. She set down her cup and went to the bottom of the stairs. Elsie was standing on the third step from the top, still in her nightgown, looking down at her. "Good morning," Nora said. Elsie looked at her for a long moment. Then she came down the stairs, one careful step at a time, and when she reached the bottom, she stood directly in front of Nora and looked up at her with those dark eyes that seemed to operate about 12 layers deeper than anyone else's. "Are you hungry?" Nora asked. Elsie didn't answer, but she reached out and took Nora's hand. And that was how the first morning started. Gideon came down at 6 exactly the way Mrs. Aldridge had said and found Nora and Elsie at the kitchen table together. Elsie was sitting with a piece of bread she was not eating, but her shoulder was touching Nora's arm, and Nora was talking, just talking, about nothing in particular, about the sound the wind had been making last night across the ridge, about whether it meant the weather was going to change, and Elsie was listening in that particular way she had, with her whole body, with a stillness that was somehow not the same as the silence Gideon had been living with for 2 years. He stood in the doorway and didn't say anything. Mrs. Aldridge appeared at his elbow with a cup of coffee and said, quietly, she ate half the bread already. Gideon looked at her. "Elsie," Mrs. Aldridge said, "she ate half before you came down. First time she's eaten at that table without someone standing over her since she stopped. In a while." Gideon took his coffee and went to the table and sat down across from them, and Nora looked up and said good morning, and Elsie looked at him too with what he was fairly certain, though he couldn't have proven it, was something close to satisfaction. "Sleep all right?" he asked Nora. "Fine," she said. "Not wonderful. Not oh, the bed was so comfortable. Thank you so much. Just fine." He appreciated that more than he could have easily explained. "I thought we might talk this morning," he said. "About Elsie. What you might try." "I'm not going to try anything," Nora said. He blinked. "I mean in terms of a plan, a method." "I know what you mean," she said. "And I'm telling you, I'm not going to try anything. Not with Elsie. I'm just going to be here." She looked down at the child beside her. She doesn't need a method. She needs someone who isn't waiting for her to do something different. Gideon set down his coffee cup. "The physicians said—" "The physicians aren't here," Nora said. Not unkindly, but without any give in it either. "You hired them to fix something. That's different from what she needs." He sat with that for a moment. It landed somewhere uncomfortable, the way true things sometimes do. "And what does she need?" he asked. Nora looked at him across the table, And then she looked at Elsie Sen, and then she said something he would turn over in his mind for weeks afterward. Someone who can sit in the quiet without getting scared of it, she said. The days settled into a shape that no one had planned, and everyone eventually accepted. Nora worked mornings with Elsie, worked being the approximate word for what they actually did, which was more accurately described as being in the same place, at the same time, doing unhurried things. They walked the property. They sat on the porch. Nora brought out mending work and sewed while Elsie watched, and eventually Elsie began to hand her thread, or hold pieces of fabric, not because anyone asked her to, but because it seemed to occur to her that she could. She began to make small sounds, not words, not yet, but sounds that served the function of words. A particular hum that meant yes. A different quality of silence that meant no. Nora responded to these as though they were the most natural communication in the world, without making any ceremony of it, without calling attention to the progress the way Gideon couldn't help doing whenever he noticed it. That was one of the first things Nora told him directly. They were on the porch. One evening after supper, Elsie already in bed, the heat finally breaking at the end of the day into something that merely felt warm instead of oppressive. You have to stop celebrating every little thing she does, Nora said. Gideon turned to look at her. I'm her father. I know you are. And every time she makes a sound and you look at her like she's just walked on water, she goes quieter afterward. She picked up the mending she'd carried out with her and threaded a needle. She's not performing. She's just living. If you treat everything she does like a miracle, she'll start feeling like she has to be a miracle. And that's too heavy for a 7-year-old. He was quiet for a moment. Margaret used to say something like that, he said. He hadn't planned to say it. Nora didn't make a sound. She just waited, the way she waited for Elsie. She used to say, I had a way of turning everything into a project, he said, including people. She sounds like she was perceptive, Nora said. She was. The crickets start up somewhere out in the grass. The last of the orange light left the sky and the stars appeared, one by one, doing what they'd always done without any help from him at all. I'm not trying to manage Elsie, he said after a while. It came out stiffer than he meant it. I know, Nora said. That's not what I said. Then what? I said you're scared. She didn't look up from the mending. And scared people watch too hard. And children feel that watching. He opened his mouth, closed it. She said, she already knows you love her. That part got through. What she needs now is for you to be in the same room with her without needing anything back. He sat with that in the darkness for a long time. He didn't argue. What nobody had warned him about, what he hadn't thought to anticipate, was the way Copper Hollow would respond to Nora's presence at the ranch. He had expected some talk. There was always talk in a town this size. He had not expected it to be organized. The first sign was subtle enough that he almost missed it. He went to deposit a payment at First Territorial Bank on a Thursday morning, and the conversation with the branch manager, Fenton Albright, had a quality to it that was slightly off, a few more pauses than usual, a smile that stayed a half second too long in places, the particular quality of a man who has been talking about you and is now talking at you. Gideon let it go. He had other things to think about. The second sign was less subtle. He was at the hardware merchant that same afternoon when Cecilia Vane came in with 2 of her regular companions, Mrs. Prentice and Mrs. Dormer, and the 3 of them moved through the store with the precise choreography of women who have decided something together and are now executing. They collected their items. They got in line behind Gideon, and Cecilia Vane said, at a volume she had calibrated to be audible without being undeniable, I do feel for that little girl. Having to grow up around that kind of influence. Mrs. Prentice made a sympathetic sound. At that age, they absorb everything, Mrs. Vane continued. A mother's example is everything, and when the example is well. A pause. We can only pray. Gideon turned around. He turned around slowly, the way men do when they are deciding, in the interval of the turn, how angry they are actually going to allow themselves to be. Cecilia Vane looked at him with an expression that was precisely arranged to be readable in multiple ways, all of them defensible. He said very quietly, My daughter is thriving for the first time in 2 years, Mrs. Vane. She smiled. Of course, we're all so glad to hear it. Then I'd be grateful, he said, if that's where the conversation stayed. He paid for his items and left. Outside on the sidewalk, he stood for a moment in the heat and breathed slowly and reminded himself that he was a man who did not pick unnecessary fights with the wives of town council members. He was still reminding himself of that when he got home and found Nora at the kitchen table with a bruise on her left wrist. "What happened?" he said. Nora looked down at the wrist, then back up at him. "Caught it on a gate latch, Nora." Something in his voice made her meet his eyes. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. "Mrs. Hardcastle and her daughter," she said in the dry goods. It was nothing. She had her parasol, and she wasn't watching where she was putting it. "She hit you with a parasol." "She wasn't watching," Nora said again, firm. "Nora, if someone." She said his name the way she said everything, directly and without ornament, and it stopped him. "I know what you want to do. I can see it on your face. You want to go to whoever did this and make very clear what happens when someone touches a person under your roof. And if you do that, it becomes your story, your power, your protection." She paused, and I become a woman who needed saving. Again, he stood there. "I've been that woman," she said. "When Caleb died and the bank came, everyone wanted to help me. On their terms, I want to never be that again. So please let me handle what's mine to handle. And if it gets worse, then I'll tell you," she said. "And then you can be angry. But not before." He pulled out a chair and sat down at the table across from her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Elsie wandered in from the direction of the parlor, took in the two of them sitting there, and came to stand beside Nora with her customary gravity. She looked at the bruised wrist. She looked at Nora's face. Then she reached out and very carefully placed her small hand over the wrist, not pressing, just covering it. Nora's jaw moved. Gideon looked at the ceiling. "All right," he said. "Terms." But it didn't get better. It escalated the way these things escalate in small towns, not through grand confrontations, but through the accumulation of small exclusions. The banker's wife, who happened to be at every social gathering Nora passed and managed never to introduce her. The church ladies, who had previously bought mending work from Nora through Mrs. Caldwell, and who now suddenly had found other arrangements. The grocer, who developed a habit of being occupied when Nora came in with the household list, so that the youngest boy, who was 17 and mortified about the whole thing, had to assist her instead. And then Horace Vane came to the ranch. He arrived on a Monday afternoon unannounced, which was itself a statement. Vane was a man who understood the social weight of arriving unannounced at someone's home. He had a bottle of good bourbon with him, which Gideon recognized as the kind of gift that was also a negotiating tool. And he sat in the front parlor with his hat in his lap, and his expression arranged into something that wanted to read as reluctant friendship. "I'll come straight to the point," Vane said. "I respect you too much to do otherwise." Gideon waited. "There's talk," Vane said. "You know there is. A woman of her history, in your household, with your daughter people, are drawing their own conclusions, and some of those conclusions are going to start affect your business relationships if this continues." "Which business relationships specifically?" Gideon said. "Albright at First Territorial is uneasy. The Hendersons have been asking questions about the North Range deal. There are 3 merchants on the council who are wondering aloud whether your judgment has been affected." Vane leaned forward slightly. "I'm not here to pile on, Gideon. I'm here because I've known you 15 years, and I'd rather tell you in private than let you find out at a council meeting." Gideon looked at the bourbon on the table. He looked at Vane. "My judgment," he said. "Your reputation," Vane corrected, which was worse. "My daughter spoke for the first time in 2 years," Gideon said. The word she said was warm. She said it to Nora Bellamy, who she had never met, within 5 minutes of meeting her. "The physicians I have paid considerable money to over the past 2 years did not accomplish that. The tutors did not accomplish that." He paused. "So when you tell me that my business associates have concerns about my judgment, I would appreciate it if you could help me understand what better judgment would look like. Specifically." Vane's expression shifted. "I understand the child." "Elsie," Gideon said. "Her name is Elsie." "Elsie," Vane said, with the care of a man calibrating his tone. "I understand that you believe this woman has helped her. I'm not disputing that. What I'm saying is that there's a cost to the way this looks, and I'm asking you to consider who she is," Gideon said. "Pardon?" "You're asking me to consider who she is, what she came from, what she lost." He stood up, not aggressively, but with the particular clarity of a man who has reached the end of the conversation he was willing to have. "She's a widow who lost a husband and a farm in a drought year, Horace. I have 3 ranchers in the territory who barely survived the same drought, who are sitting on profitable land today because the water rights held. The difference between them and Nora Bellamy is a matter of geography and luck, not character. Vane was quiet for a moment. I hear you, he said carefully. But the rest of this town can manage its own opinions, Gideon said. He picked up the bourbon and handed it back. I appreciate the concern. I do. But I think we're done here. Vane took the bottle. He stood, settled his hat, and moved toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped without turning. The Hendersons are serious buyers, he said. That's a good deal for you. I'd hate to see it fall through. I'd hate that too, Gideon said. Vane left. Gideon stood in the empty parlor and looked at the place where he'd been sitting, and then he went to the window and watched the man's buggy move back down the drive toward the road. He had not been lying. He had meant every word. He was also, if he was being honest with himself, aware that he had just made things significantly more complicated. What Vane's visit did, more than anything, was clarify something for Gideon that had been sitting at the edge of his understanding like a word he couldn't quite remember. He had told himself that keeping Nora at the ranch was about Elsie. He had told himself it was a practical arrangement, a business decision even, the most efficient solution to a problem that had resisted every other approach. He was good at telling himself things in business-appropriate language. But sitting in that parlor after Vane left, he understood that he had not asked Nora to stay because of Elsie's alone. He had asked her because of the way she had walked across that street, because of the conditions she had set, because of the way she'd said, I have had enough of being someone else's story, with the calm dignity of a person who had decided something fundamental about herself and intended to live by it regardless of what it cost. He recognized that, not from other people's, necessarily, but from somewhere in himself, the version of himself that existed before he had learned to translate everything into calculations. He didn't do anything about this recognition. He filed it, the way he filed inconvenient information, in the part of himself he intended to examine later and rarely did. He went to find Elsie instead. She was in the side garden with Nora, who had started something there that Gideon had watched develop, without quite understanding. It had begun with Nora pulling a few dead plants that had been left from the previous season, just tidying, the way industrious people tidy when their hands need occupation. Then Elsie had appeared beside her and begun helping, not asked, just present and useful. Now there were rows of something actually planted beans and carrots, and what looked like squash, nothing grand, a kitchen garden the size of a tablecloth, but tended with the specific care of 2 people who had decided this small thing mattered. He stood at the garden gate and watched for a minute. Nora was kneeling in the dirt. Elsie was beside her, doing the same, her small fingers pressing seeds into the earth with a concentration that belonged to a surgeon or an architect. They were talking, not dramatically, not the kind of conversation that had weight or consequence. Nora was explaining why the beans needed to be an inch apart. Elsie was pressing seeds carefully, precisely, 1 inch apart, or close to it. Then Elsie said something. It was quick, under her breath, and Gideon wasn't close enough to hear the word, but he heard the voice, Elsie's voice, the one he had spent 2 years waiting for, and he gripped the gatepost. Nora turned to look at her, nodded once, seriously, as though the observation had been entirely reasonable and she was filing it appropriately. Then she handed Elsie another seed, and Elsie planted it. Gideon stood at the gate for a long time without moving. He understood what Nora had meant about watching too hard. He also understood, standing there, that he could not stop himself from doing it, that this was his nature to watch, to assess, to need to know whether things were all right. It was a character flaw. He had managed it into something functional over the years, turned it into a business mind, turned it into a leadership quality. But its origin was something less dignified, something closer to fear. He pushed off from the gatepost and went back to the house. There was work to do. There was always work to do. He was very practiced at finding it. The Henderson deal fell through. Thomas Henderson sent a letter instead of coming in person, which told Gideon everything he needed to know about whose influence had reached them then first. The letter was courteous and vague about reasons and offered to revisit the conversation in the future, which was the formal language of a door being closed without the noise of slamming. He sat in his office and read it twice. The North Range parcel was good land, good grass, a natural extension of his current holdings. Losing it was not catastrophic, but it was money. Real money. The kind that made the Vane conversation retroactively more complicated. He thought about calling Vane. He thought about going to Henderson directly and making this case in person, which he would ordinarily have done, which would ordinarily have worked. He thought about what it would mean to do that, what it would implicitly concede. He put the letter in his desk drawer and went to supper. Nora and Elsie were already at the table. Mrs. Aldridge had made a beef stew that filled the kitchen with the kind of smell that made everything seem temporarily manageable. Elsie was telling Nora something he caught the end of it as he came in. A few words about the bean seeds, whether the rain that morning had been enough or too much, and then she saw him and stopped. Not in fear, not in her old silence. She stopped the way anyone stops a private conversation when a third person enters the room. Then she looked at her father and patted the chair beside her. Gideon sat down. "How are the beans?" he said. Elsie considered this with the gravity of a person reporting on a serious matter. Then she said clearly and deliberately, "Okay." One word, but a new one. He nodded as though she'd told him something he already knew and was glad to have confirmed. "Good," he said. Nora was looking at her stew, but Gideon saw the corner of her mouth. September arrived, and with it a new campaign from the bankers' wives that had been organized well enough to qualify as something close to professional. The first element was social. Nora had begun to occasionally accompany Gideon to town for household errands, and the quality of those encounters had been degrading steadily. Fewer people who nodded in passing, more deliberate routes taken that happened to require crossing to the other sidewalk. Nora bore it the way she bore most things that came at her, which was with a stillness that Gideon was beginning to understand, was not indifference, but a very specific, very practiced kind of endurance. The second element was more direct. He was at the land office on a Tuesday when Marcus Prentice, whose wife he had seen with Cecilia Vane at the hardware store, took him aside and told him, with the air of a man doing a difficult favor, that there were people in town saying Nora Bellamy was at the Rourke Ranch to get herself a wealthy husband, that the whole arrangement with the child was a calculated performance, and that Gideon, being a man who'd had his heart broken once, was perhaps not seeing the situation with the clarity it deserved. Gideon looked at Marcus Prentice. Marcus Prentice was a man who built furniture. He made fine furniture, very good chairs especially, and Gideon had always respected him for the craft. He was also a man who had been married to Eleanor Prentice for 20 years and had therefore either learned to hold her views or forgotten how not to. "Marcus," Gideon said, "when your shop burned down 8 years ago and you had no insurance, who covered your materials cost for the next 6 months?" Marcus Prentice was quiet. "I'm not saying that to collect on it," Gideon said. "I'm saying it because at the time you were not in a position to offer me anything, and I didn't need you to be. And if Eleanor had been in Nora Bellamy's position after that fire, I would have expected this town to extend rent her some common decencies." He picked up his hat. "Tell her I said hello." He walked out. He drove home with his jaw set and a tight, specific anger in his chest that was partly about the Prentice conversation and partly about the Henderson deal and partly about the bourbon Vane had brought and taken back, and partly about something harder to name the recognition that he was. Living in a town that had decided to test him, and that he had been, for most of his adult life, exactly the kind of man who had made it easy for that town to believe it knew his price. He found Nora that evening on the back porch after Elsie was in bed. She was working on a quilt, not mending, actually making something, piecing squares of different fabric together on her lap. Some of the pieces looked old, worn at the edges, and some were newer, and the effect was something patchwork and deliberate and oddly interesting to look at. He sat in the other chair. "The Prentice conversation," he said, up. "You heard?" He told me himself. He paused. He said, "People think you're here because of that you have intentions toward you," she said. "Yes," she went back to the quilt. Put a needle through fabric, pulled thread. "What do you think?" "I think you are the least calculating person I've met in a professional context," he said. She almost laughed. "Not quite. Professional context. I don't know what other context applies." "No," she said. I suppose you don't." She worked in silence for a moment. "Do you want me to leave? I'm asking seriously. If the business cost is..." No, he said. The word came out flat and immediate, and did not leave room for follow-up. She looked at him. No, he said again, this time with slightly more control over it. I lost the Henderson deal. There may be others. That's a business problem. I have had business problems before. I will manage it. And the rest of it? The town. The talk. I'm tired, he said, of managing what the town thinks. He hadn't meant to say that either. It seemed to be a night for that. I've been doing it since I was young enough that it felt like a survival skill. You watch how people see you. You manage the perception. You protect the position. He looked out at the dark ranch yard, the barn lights, the horses moving in the far paddock. My daughter walked across a public street in front of Horace Vane to hold on to you. And that, of all the things in my life, is the thing I'm least willing to apologize for. The quilt was still in Nora's hands. She wasn't moving. Gideon, she said. I know, he said. I know what you're going to say. What am I going to say? That this isn't my fight to pick for you. That you have conditions. That you don't want to be the story. She considered him. Actually, she said, I was going to say thank you. He blinked. Because I've been sitting here, she said quietly, trying to figure out whether I should leave on my own before you have to ask me to. Whether staying is fair to you and Elsie with everything it costs. And you just answered that. She folded the quilt carefully in her lap. So, thank you. He didn't know what to say to that. He said, what is the quilt? She looked down at it. Pieces, she said. Things from the homestead. This square here is from Caleb's work shirt. This one is from a curtain we had in the kitchen. This one she touched a smaller square of faded blue. This is from Elsie's dress. The one she was wearing when I met her. He stared at it. I don't know what it's going to be yet, she said. But I'm not throwing the pieces away. The night was full of the sounds the country makes when it's left alone. Insects, winds, something small moving in the brush at the edge of the yard. Stars were doing what they always did. Gideon looked at the quilt and then at the woman holding it, and the thing he had filed in the inconvenient drawer shifted slightly, like something coming loose from where it had been stored, and he left it alone because he was a careful man, and there were things he was not ready to look at directly. But he stayed on the porch, and she kept sewing, and neither of them felt the particular need to fill the silence with anything which was, as Nora had once told him, exactly what it felt like when someone could sit in the quiet without being scared of it. The fever arrived without announcement, the way the worst things always do. It started in the second week of October, out in the railroad settlement east of town, where 300 workers and their families lived in the particular poverty of people doing dangerous work for wages that sounded reasonable until you calculated what they actually bought. The settlement had its own internal logic, its own informal hierarchies, its own communal arrangements for childcare and cooking and the management of disputes. And for the most part, Copper Hollow had been content to let that logic operate at a comfortable distance. The workers built the railroad. The railroad brought commerce. The commerce enriched the town. Nobody needed to think too carefully about the chain of events between those points. When the first reports came in a foreman down with fever, 2 families in adjoining tents sick by the following morning, Copper Hollow's response was swift and unanimous and wrong. Town council met on a Thursday. Gideon was not on the council, which had always suited him. He had too many business interests that required careful management to want the complications that council membership added. But he was the kind of man who got told things, kind whose opinion was solicited even when it hadn't been asked for. He heard about the meeting from his foreman, Walt Briggs, who had a cousin on the council, which was how information actually moved in Copper Hollow, regardless of what the formal processes suggested. The council's position, as relayed by Walt and confirmed by Gideon's own subsequent conversations, was essentially this: the settlement was outside town boundaries. The sick were settlement residents, and the most prudent course of action was to formalize that separation. No movement of settlement residents into town. No shared resources. A boundary line maintained until the fever ran its course. Horace Vane had seconded the motion. It had passed with 1 dissent. Gideon heard this and said nothing immediately. He was at his desk in the ranch office with the evening accounts spread in front of him, and he sat very still for a moment and looked at the numbers without seeing them. How many sick? He asked Walt. 15 confirmed when I heard last. That was this afternoon. Could be more by now, children. Walt looked at the floor briefly. Some. Gideon closed the account book. That'll be all, Walt. He went to find Nora. She was in the kitchen, Elsie, the two of them at the table, with a lamp between them and a half-finished section of the quilt spread across the surface. Elsie was sorting fabric scraps by color with the methodical precision she brought to any task she decided was worth her attention, and Nora was stitching two pieces together and describing what she was doing as she worked, not teaching. Exactly. Just narrating, the way she narrated everything for Elsie, as though the world was a story worth following. Gideon stood in the doorway. Elsie looked up at him. Something in his face made her set down the fabric in her hands. "There's a fever in the railroad settlement," he said. Nora looked up. "The council has voted to isolate the settlement. No resources in, no people out." He paused. Vane supported it. Nora was quiet for a moment. The needle stopped moving. "How many people are out there?" she said. 300, roughly. Plus families. How many sick? 15 that we know of. As of this afternoon. She put the quilt down on the table. "It'll be more by morning," she said. "In a settlement that close together, 15 is just the start. I know. They don't have a physician out there. The town physician is—" He stopped. "Is inside the boundary line," Nora finished. "Yes." She stood up from the table. Elsie watched her, then looked at her father, then back at Nora, reading something in the air between dark, reading something leads to the leads and pony that she couldn't have named, but clearly understood was significant. "What are you going to do?" Nora asked him. It was the same question she'd asked on the porch, about the town, about the talk. What are you going to do? Not accusing, not directing, just asking. The way someone asks who genuinely wants to know the answer. "I don't know yet," he said. It was the most honest answer he'd given anyone in a long time. Couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the Henderson letter in his desk drawer and the Prentice conversation and the bourbon Vane had brought and taken back. He thought about the account books and the North Range parcel and the 3 merchant relationships that were cooling toward him with the specific temperature of men managing their associations carefully. He thought about the settlement, about the tents in the dark out past the eastern edge of town, about 15 people sick, and whatever the number was by now, midnight with the disease moving through canvas walls and shared cooking fires. He thought about Elsie planting bean seeds 1 inch apart with her small, careful fingers. He got up at 2 in the morning and went down to his office and sat at the desk in the dark. He was not a man who had ever operated from feelings. That was not a boast and not an apology, just an observation. He had built his cattle empire on assessment, on calculation, on the disciplined management of risk. He understood the value of emotion, and other people understood that fear motivated workers and that loyalty was worth cultivating and that grief could make a man reckless. But he had always kept his own feelings organized, filed in their proper places, retrievable when relevant, and contained when not. The organization was failing. He sat in his dark office and let it fail, just for a few minutes. Let himself feel what he had been filing away for weeks, the anger about the Henderson deal, the anger about Vane, the accumulated exhaustion of being a wealthy man in a small town who had operated for years on the implicit understanding that his wealth was a form of wisdom, that his success was a form of moral authority, that the people who had less had, in some accounting he'd never examined too carefully, arranged that situation themselves. Nora had not arranged it. Caleb Bellamy had worked the land the way Gideon had worked his land 30 years ago, with the same hours and the same physical cost and the same hope that the rain would come and the market would hold. The drought had made them different. Geography had made them different. A few years and a few hundred acres and a water table that happened to sit at a survivable depth had made Gideon Rourke and not Gideon Bellamy. He sat with that.
He sat
with the 300 people in the settlement and their 15 sick who were out there right now in the cold October night, while the town council had drawn a line and Horace Vane had seconded the motion and the boundary held. At 3 in the morning, he lit the lamp and pulled out a piece of paper and started writing. By the time Nora came downstairs at 5:30, he had a plan. She found him at the kitchen table with papers spread around a coffee cup and the particular gray look of a man who had been hard about all night, thinking hard about something, and had arrived somewhere he hadn't expected. She didn't say good morning. She poured herself coffee, sat down across from him, and looked at the papers. "Talk," she said. He talked. The warehouse, the large cattle storage warehouse he owned on the south edge of town, which was empty between late October and the spring cattle drive, could be converted to a temporary hospital. Not quickly, not easily, but it could be done. He had the lumber. He had the manpower, or could get it. He had food stores that could be released. The sick could be moved there under supervised conditions that actually allowed for management and care and separation of the contagious from the not yet sick, rather than just left out there in canvas tents in October. Nora listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "The council won't approve this." "No. Vane especially won't approve it." "No, you'd be going against a formal council decision. There will be consequences for that, real ones." "I know," he said. She looked at him across the coffee cups and the papers and the lamp that had been burning since 3 in the morning. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him on the main street when he'd first asked her to walk with him, that measuring quality. That search for whatever was underneath the stated intention. "This is your business," she said. "Your warehouse. Your stores, these are real costs." "Yes." "And the council relationships. And whatever business Vane can damage further." "Yes." She was quiet. "Nora," he said, "there are children sick in those tents." She put her coffee cup down. "I know." She pressed her hands flat on the table. A gesture he'd learned meant she was thinking something through to its end before speaking. "If you open the warehouse, you'll need people inside it who know what they're doing with sick patients. The town physician won't cross the line he helped establish. You'll need people who aren't afraid of the sick and aren't worried about what it costs them socially. I'll need you," he said. "Yes," she said, "you'll need me." He held her eyes. "Are you willing?" She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the table for a moment, and he understood that she was not being dramatic about the pause, she was being honest. Actually thinking about it, the cost of it, the danger of it. Then she said, "Caleb died without anyone around him who knew what to do. He got sick in the night, and by morning he was gone, and I was alone on a piece of land I didn't have the legal right to stay on." She looked up. "Yes, I'm willing." They went to the settlement that morning. Gideon had a brief and brittle conversation with the 2 men the council had posted at the Eastern Road, not official lawmen, just town ears, with the particular authority of men doing what the town had decided, and he made it clear that he was going to the settlement to assess the situation, and that they were not going to stop him. And the specific quality of his voice, when he said this, made both men step back without quite understanding why. What they found at the settlement was worse than the numbers had suggested. 23 sick by that morning count, with more presenting symptoms throughout the day. The fever was high and fast-moving. One of the older Italian workers, a man named Benedetti, who had apparently been healthy at supper 2 nights ago, was in a serious condition. 3 children, 1 infant. The settlement's informal leader, a big Welsh foreman named Thomas Rees, met them at the edge of the tent line with the wary posture of a man who had been let down by enough official concern to treat any new version of it with caution. "We don't need sympathy," Rees said. "We need a physician and food and somewhere to put the ones who are bad enough that the rest can't care for them and work." "I have a warehouse," Gideon said. Rees looked at him. "I know who you are. Then you know I can back what I say." Another pause. Rees looked at Nora beside him, clearly trying to place her. "She knows what to do with sick people?" Rees asked. "Better than anyone else you're going to get from town," Gideon said. Rees looked at the tents behind him. Something moved across his face, not trust. Exactly. But the pragmatic calculation of a man who had run out of other options. "When?" he said. "Tomorrow morning," Gideon said. "If we start today." Followed was the most complicated 48 hours of work Gideon had done in his adult life. And he had built a cattle empire in the Wyoming territory, which was not the easiest place or time to do it. The warehouse conversion required lumber rearranged into partition walls that allowed for separation of cases. It required straw pallets and blankets from his stores. It required a water system barrels refilled by wagon twice daily, which meant 2 of his ranch hands on that rotation permanently. It required cooking for potentially hundreds of people, which meant coordinating with the settlement's own cooks and supplementing from his private food stores in a way that he had done rough calculations on and understood would hurt, but had decided not to think about too carefully. He also had to manage what was happening in town simultaneously. Vane came to him before the day was out. Not in person. This time, Vane sent a written message, formal and cold, informing Gideon that his actions were in direct contravention of a council decision and that there would be a formal meeting to address the matter. Gideon wrote back, "There are children sick. I have a warehouse that can help. Have the meeting." Then he went back to work. Walt Briggs organized the ranch hands. Two of his men had settlement connections, brothers whose father had worked rail before moving to cattle, and they went to the settlement and came back with 4 settlement workers willing to help with the conversion in exchange for the understanding that their families would be among the first moved if the situation worsened. Gideon said yes without hesitation and didn't put conditions on it. Nora organized the care side of it with a competence that Gideon found himself watching when he could spare the attention. She had no formal medical training. What she was 2 years of nursing a dying husband through a long illness in an isolated homestead with no physician within reasonable distance, which had given her a practical knowledge of fever management, fluid maintenance, most particular skill, and the particular skill of recognizing when someone was turning toward recovery versus when they were moving the other direction. She also had, which was perhaps equally important, the quality of being completely unfrightened by suffering. Not hardened to it, he could see that it cost her, in the set of her shoulders at the end of each day, in the way she'd go very quiet sometimes, but not paralyzed by it either. She moved through the sick with the efficiency of someone who understood that her own test was not useful to anyone lying on a pallet with a 104-degree fever. Elsie, who Gideon had initially planned to leave at the ranch with Mrs. Aldridge, had produced such an uncharacteristically clear and direct resistance to this plan, not shouting, not tears, just a very specific quality of stillness that communicated I will not be managed away from this more effectively than either that he had compromised. Elsie stayed at the warehouse entrance each day, staying well clear of the Zinspeach the sick quarters, organizing blankets and helping the settlement children who were not ill by keeping them occupied while their parents worked or recovered. She had appointed herself to this role without consulting anyone, and she performed it with the gravity of someone who had decided this was what she was for. She spoke more words in those first 3 days than she had in the previous 2 years combined. Not to Gideon, mostly to the children, in that quiet, understated way of hers, the way that didn't demand anything back. By the end of the 3rd day, 2 of the smaller settlement children were following her around, like she was someone they had always known. Gideon watched this and filed it in the same place. He filed everything. He wasn't ready to examine directly, which was filling up. The council meeting happened on the 4th day. It was not a pleasant hour. Vane had brought 3 council members and a written statement about liability and town authority that had clearly been drafted by someone with legal training. Gideon sat across the table from them and let the statement be read in full, before he said anything which seemed to unsettle the reader who had expected interruption. When it was finished, Gideon said, "How many sick now?" Vane looked at him. "That's not the relevant." 31, said the single council member who had dissented at the original vote, a dry goods merchant named Arthur Lyle, who was 60 years old and had the specific moral authority of a man who had stopped caring about social cost somewhere in his 50s. 31 sick this morning, 4 critical. The infant is improving, which is the first good news in 3 days. Because someone is caring for them, Gideon said. Someone and somewhere. You had no authority, Vane began. I had a warehouse, Gideon said, and people were sick. Those are the 2 facts that seem most material to me. You have violated a council decision and set a precedent that a wealthy private citizen can simply override. Horace. Gideon leaned forward on the table, not aggressively, but with the particular quality of a man who has decided exactly how much further this conversation should go. I'm going to ask you something honestly. If William had been in those tents when the fever started, and the town had drawn that line, and someone with a warehouse and food and the ability to help had decided that the council decision was more important than doing it, what would you have thought of that man? The room was very quiet. Vane's jaw was tight. That's not fair. It's the only question, Gideon said. Everything else is paperwork. Arthur Lyle made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was related to one. The meeting ended without formal resolution, which meant without the sanction Vane had wanted, which was itself a kind of decision. Then on the 8th night, the storm came. It had been building since afternoon. Anyone who'd spent time in Wyoming territory knew that particular quality of sky, the purple-green along the western horizon, that meant serious weather, not just rain. By evening, the wind had picked up enough to make the warehouse walls shudder, and by midnight, it was a full storm, rain driving sideways, lightning somewhere to the southwest, the creek east of the settlement running higher than it had all season. Gideon was at the warehouse when the first water came under the eastern wall. It was not a trickle. It was a creeping sheet of floodwater moving across the packed earth floor, cold and dark, reaching toward the pallets where 31 sick people were sleeping. Walt Briggs found him already assessing the wall supports when he came in from outside dripping rain. "Creek's breached," Walt said. "South Bank. It's moving this way." "How much time?" "Maybe 2 hours before it's serious. Could be less depending on how much more comes down." Gideon looked at the walls. The warehouse was old solid, but old, built for cattle storage, not for flood conditions. The eastern wall, in particular, had a foundation that sat lower than the western side, which meant the water would continue to push in from that direction, and the pressure would build. He had timber. He had workers. He had 31 sick people who could not be moved quickly into an octo storm. He made a decision. "Get me Walt Garrison and the Henderson brothers," he said. "Get me every man in this building who can swing a hammer. And get me the timber from the South Cattle Pen." Walt stared at him. "That's the new pen. You just had it built last—" "Get the timber," Gideon said. What happened in the next 4 hours was, years later, the thing Gideon remembered most clearly about all of it, not the council meeting, not the first morning at the settlement, but those 4 hours in the storm. They took the cattle pen apart in the rain and dark, working by lantern light that kept threatening to go out, and they used the heavy timber to shore up the eastern wall and to build raised walkways through the warehouse's floor so that the patients could stay elevated above the water that continued to come in. Settlement workers worked beside ranch hands who had never spoken to them. Thomas Reese, who had been skeptical of Gideon in their first conversation, worked next to Gideon himself for 3 straight hours, without anyone discussing it. Nora moved patients. She and 2 settlement women and Mrs. Aldridge, who had appeared from somewhere around midnight with a covered wagon full of additional blankets, and the particular expression of a woman who had decided her feelings about the situation were irrelevant, shifted the sickest patients to the raised sections, and organized the ones who could sit upright into a line along the highest interior wall, wrapped in everything available. Elsie was in there too. Gideon saw her at one point in the middle of it all, sitting with her back against the wall at the far end, a small settlement girl on each side of her, all 3 of them wrapped in a single blanket. She had her arms around both of them. Her eyes were open, watching the room, watching the men work and the water move and the lanterns swing in the wind that kept finding gaps in the walls. She was completely calm. He had never seen her look more like Margaret than in that moment. He looked at her for as long as he could spare, which was 3 seconds, and then he picked up a timber and went back to work. The wall held. At 4 in the morning, the rain began to ease, and by 5 the lightning had moved east, and by the time the gray light came through the cracks in the warehouse boards, the water on the floor had stopped rising and was beginning slowly to find its way back to where it had come from. Nobody cheered. People were too tired for that. But there was a quality in the room that Gideon had felt before in high-stakes situations, that particular human exhale, collective and involuntary. That happens when the thing you were afraid of passes and leaves you still standing. Thomas Reese appeared beside him. Both of them were soaked through and covered in the particular mud that came from hasty construction in driving rain. "That pen you tore up," Reese said. "It's all right," Gideon said. "It's not nothing," Reese said. "I want to be clear that we know that." Gideon looked at him. "How are your people?" "2 of the critical ones are worse. The others held through the night." He paused. "Your woman Bellamy, she didn't sleep." "I know, she's something else." "Yes," Gideon said. "She is." Nora was across the room, sitting on an upturned crate, her hair loose from the pins that had held it the previous night, a cup of something hot in both hands. She was looking at the floor with the expression of someone who had just run out of the ability to hold themselves upright, but hadn't yet received permission to stop. One of the settlement women was saying something to her in low Italian that Nora clearly didn't understand and was clearly nonetheless grateful for. Gideon crossed the room. He didn't say anything when he reached her. He sat down on the floor beside the crate, his back against the wall, and was there, the way she had taught him to be, just present, without needing anything back. After a moment, she said very quietly, "The infant is going to be fine." "Good," he said. "The Benedetti man." She stopped. "I know," he said. She pressed her lips together, breathed once, slowly. "I don't know that I did everything." "You did everything," he said. "Everything that could be done." "You don't know that." "No," he admitted. "But I know you, and that's close enough." She looked at him sideways, and something in her face shifted, not quite breaking, but moving toward it, the way something moves when it has been held rigid for too long, and the situation finally allows it to ease. "I'm very tired," she said. "I know," he said. "Stay there. I'll handle the rest of this morning. You're also exhausted." "I'm accustomed to it," he said. "You should sleep." She didn't argue, which told him more about how tired she was than anything else would have. Dawn broke over a changed Copper Hollow. Or not yet changed. Changed things don't happen overnight, no matter how dramatic the night has been. Something had shifted in the moral weather of the town the way physical weather shifts after a big storm, leaving the air with a different quality, a different weight. People had watched the lights in the warehouse all night. Word had moved through town, the way word always moved faster than anyone official could manage. More accurate than most people wanted to admit. People knew the creek had breached. People knew the fence had come down. People knew Gideon Rourke had been in there with his foreman and 24 settlement workers for 4 hours in the rain, doing something that didn't have a name in the existing social vocabulary of Copper Hollow. Arthur Lyle showed up at the warehouse at 7 in the morning with 3 women from his congregation and a wagon full of food. He didn't announce himself or ask permission. He just came in and looked around at the state of things and told the women to start distributing the food and went to find Gideon. 14 families in town want to know what they can send, he said, without preamble. Gideon blinked at him. He had not slept. His capacity for surprise was limited. 14? More by afternoon, probably. Last night got around. Lyle looked at the room, the wet floor, the raised walkways, the patients along the walls, the general evidence of a night that had been survived by a margin. "What do you need most?" "Blankets," Gideon said. "Dry ones. And food that's easy on a fever broth if anyone has it. And someone who can sit with the 2 critical cases while Nora sleeps." "I'll stay myself," Lyle said. Gideon looked at him for a moment. "I'm 62 years old, and I've been awake since 3, Lyle said, "which means I'm useless for anything physical. But I can sit, and I can watch, and I can tell someone if the breathing changes." "All right," Gideon said. Lyle moved off toward the sick corner with the purposeful air of a man who had made a private decision and was now executing it. By afternoon, there were 22 people from Copper Hollow inside the warehouse. Not all of them were people Gideon would have predicted. The barber was there. One of the women who had been with Cecilia Vane at the hardware store, not Mrs. Vane's herself, but one of her companions. A woman named Helena Marsh, who arrived alone and stayed for 6 hours, and left without speaking to anyone of consequence. The young man from the grocer's, the 17-year-old, who had been mortified about the whole Nora situation, came with his mother and spent the afternoon making trips between the warehouse and the water barrels with a diligence that made Gideon feel something complicated in his chest. Horace Vane did not come, but his wife did. Cecilia Vane arrived at 4 in the afternoon with a basket covered in cloth, and she stood at the warehouse entrance for a long moment, looking at what was the arrangement of pallets, the raised floors, the settlement families and the towns in the same space doing the same work, with an expression that moved through several stages before arriving somewhere that could be called cautiously recognition. Then she set her basket down near the entrance and looked for the person in charge. She found Nora. Nora was awake again by then, had refused the sleep Gideon had tried to ensure, and was moving through the convalescent section with the steady, unhurried quality that was particular to her. She turned when Cecilia Vane said her name. The 2 women looked at each other. Cecilia said, "I brought broth and biscuits." A pause. "Horace doesn't know I'm here." Nora looked at her for a moment that went slightly long. Then she said, "The broth is exactly what we need. Thank you." Not gracious exactly. Not cold exactly. Somewhere between, the truth. Cecilia Vane nodded. She put the basket where Nora directed, and she stayed for 2 hours, and she was careful and quiet and didn't cause any problems, and when she left, she did not look for credit. and Nora did not offer any, and that was its own kind of shift. 2 of the critical patients did not survive. Benedetti died on the 10th day in the morning, with Thomas Reese sitting beside him, an older woman from the settlement, a grandmother who had apparently been constitutionally formable her entire life and had simply met something stronger, died the following afternoon. Nora sat with the Benedetti family afterward. She sat with them for a long time, in the way she sat with things, without trying to fix it, without offering reassurances that would have been false, just present in the specific darkness of a loss she understood from the inside. When she came out, she found Gideon waiting. "I couldn't," she started. "I know," he said. "He was better for 2 days, I thought." "I know," he said again. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment, a gesture he'd never seen from her before, that private kind of exhaustion. "Don't tell me it's not my fault," she said. "I know it's not my fault. But it doesn't feel like anything, except a loss," he said. She dropped her hands, looked at him. "It's a loss," he said. "That's what it is. You don't have to translate it into anything else." She looked at him for a long moment. "Margaret," she said quietly. Not a question. Just a recognition of where that understanding had come from. "Yes," he said. They were standing in the side passage of the warehouse, where the afternoon light came in at a narrow angle and the sounds from the main room were muffled. It was the closest thing to private the situation had offered in 10 days. Gideon was aware of this without being sure what to do with the awareness. "Thank you," Nora said, "for all of this. I want to say it plainly." "You don't let me say it plainly," she said. "You didn't have to do this. You did it anyway. And you did it with your whole self. Not as a half measure, not as a way of managing the optics. You did it because it was right." She held his eyes. "I want you to know that I saw that." He didn't say us anything for a moment. Then he said, "I had good reason." "Yes," she said. "You did." Outside, through the warehouse walls, Copper Hollow was going about its afternoon. Merchants opening after the storm. Families returning to repaired homes. The creek back within its banks. The evidence of the night receding into the ordinary daylight of a town that had almost been, and had survived being, something other than what it wanted to think it was. And inside the warehouse, 31 people were alive, who might not have been. 2 were not alive, who should have been, and a man who had once built walls with the patience of an architect stood in a narrow passage with a woman who had never pretended not to see them, and understood that something had changed in him so fundamentally that the man he had been 6 weeks ago would not have recognized the man he was standing there being. The fever would pass. The warehouse would eventually return to cattle storage. But the families in Copper Hollow who had come with broth and blankets and 6 hours in a space they'd been told to stay clear of would remember what they'd done and feel differently about themselves afterward. The settlement workers who had worked beside ranch hand stands through a storm would remember that, too. The 17-year-old boy who had carried water for 10 days would grow up to be someone who carried things when they were heavy. None of that was finished yet. The fever was still moving. Critical patients were still uncertain. Horace Vane had not conceded anything. But something had cracked open, the way Gideon had felt himself crack open on that dusty street in July. Standing in the middle of the road, watching his daughter walk toward a woman the whole town had decided to discard. Crack was wide enough now that there was no managing it back, and on some level he didn't want to. He looked at Nora in the narrow afternoon light, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said the things that were rising in that particular silence, because the time for those things had not quite arrived. But it was coming, the way all honest things come eventually, to people who have learned to stop being afraid of what they might find there. The fever broke on the 14th day. Not all at once, fevers don't work that way, and anyone who had spent 2 weeks inside that warehouse knew better than to trust a single morning's improvement. But by the 14th day, the pattern had shifted. The new cases had stopped appearing. The critical patients who had survived the storm night were turning a corner that felt, cautiously, like a real corner rather than a temporary plateau. The air in the warehouse changed quality, still heavy, still carrying the particular weight of sick people in a confined space, but lighter underneath it, the way air changes when something has stopped actively worsening. Nora noticed it first. She came to find Gideon in the mid-morning, when he was going over supply numbers with Walt at the warehouse entrance, and she said, simply, "I think we're past it." He looked at her. I don't want to say it too loud, she said, but I think we're past it. Walt looked at the ceiling as though calculating something. Then he excused himself to go check the water holes, which Gideon understood was the particular tact of a man who recognized when two people needed a moment. This, you're sure? Gideon said. No, Nora said, but I'm close to sure. The three who were worst are all showing the same signs. The ones who weren't critical are eating. She paused. Benedetti's wife asked me this morning if she could go home. He said nothing for a moment. What did you tell her? I told her 2 more days. To be certain. She looked at the floor briefly. She thanked me, she said. Nora stopped, shook her head slightly. What did she say? She said her husband would have thanked me too. Her voice was level, the way it was level when she was working to keep it that way. Gideon looked at her for a moment. He had learned over the previous 2 weeks not to push past what she offered, not to reach for the pieces she was still holding together. Then we plan for release in 2 days, he said. Carefully, she agreed. They stood there in the warehouse entrance with the October light coming in thin and pale behind them, and neither of them said anything about what it meant that they were past it, what it meant for what came next, what happened when the crisis was over, and the reason everyone had agreed to operate outside normal arrangements was no longer in effect. They didn't say it, but it was there. The release of the settlement families from the warehouse took the better part of 3 days rather than 2, because Nora's caution was professional grade, and she was not willing to let anyone leave who showed the slightest residual sign, regardless of how much they wanted to go, regardless of how she felt about imposing on people who had already been through enough. Thomas Rees told her on the second release day that she was harder to argue with than the rail company foreman, which he delivered as a high compliment and which she accepted as one. By the end of the 3rd day, the warehouse was largely empty. The last settlement family to leave was the Benedettis, not because they were sickest, but because the widow, a compact woman named Rosa, who had apparently decided that Nora was someone she intended to know, regardless of the language barrier between them, refused to leave until she had personally supervised the cleaning of the section of the warehouse where her husband had died. She did this with a thoroughness that left no room for dispute, and when she was finally done, she stood at the entrance and took Nora's hands in both of hers and said something in Italian that nobody in the room could translate. Nora didn't need the translation. Gideon watched from across the empty warehouse as Nora held the older woman's hands and nodded once, slowly, and Rosa Benedetti touched her face briefly, just a touch, the back of her fingers, the way a mother touches something she's grateful for, and then turned and walked out into the November air. The warehouse was quiet in a way it hadn't been in 2 weeks. Gideon looked at the space, the raised walkways they'd built from the cattle pen timber, pallets stacked in the corner, the water barrels, the evidence of 4 hours in a storm and 14 days of something he didn't quite have a name for yet. What happens to the timber? Nora asked from across the room. He looked at her. What, the timber? From the pen. She gestured at the walkways. Are you going to rebuild the pen with it? He thought about it. I'll need to replace the pen eventually, he said. But I'll buy new timber for that. She nodded, looked at the raised floors. Then leave this, she said. For now. The warehouse isn't. I know what the warehouse is for, she said. I'm just saying, leave it for now. Don't take it apart yet. He looked at her. I don't know why, she said, which was unusual for her. She was a woman who generally knew why she thought what she thought. I just don't take it apart yet. All right, he said. They walked out into the morning together. Walt was waiting with the wagon. Elsie was sitting in the wagon bed wrapped in a coat 2 sizes too large for her, talking to one of the settlement children who had apparently decided to walk alongside the wagon for no clear reason other than that Elsie was in it. When she saw her father, she looked at him with those serious dark eyes, then at Nora, then back at Gideon. Is it over? She asked. It was a full sentence, 4 words, clean and clear and directed. He climbed up onto the wagon seat and said, yes, it's over. She considered this. Then she turned back to the settlement child and resumed whatever she had been saying, with the economy of a person who had gotten the information she needed and was ready to move on. Gideon looked straight ahead down the road. Nora, sitting beside him on the bench, said nothing, but he felt her almost smile the way you feel a change in the temperature of a room. The accounting. When Gideon finally sat down to do it properly in the second week of November, once when his rough calculations had suggested, and better than his worst-case estimate. Food stores. Significant. The kind of hit that would be felt through the winter if the spring cattle market didn't compensate. The cattle pen timber, replaceable but costly to replace at this time of year, when good lumber required ordering and waiting. The ranch hand hours diverted to warehouse operations, calculable in wages, but more consequentially calculable in the work that hadn't been done at the ranch during those two, the fence sections that needed repair before winter, the herd management that had operated on reduced attention. The Henderson deal was gone. He had accepted that. Most of its windows were dark. 3 other business relationships were in various states of cooling, the particular temperature of men who were watching to see how the dust settled before they recommitted to anything. He sat with the numbers on a cold November afternoon, the lamp lit against the early dark, and he did not feel the despair he might have expected. What he felt instead was something more complicated, a kind of clear-eyed reckoning with the distance between what something costs and what it's worth, which are not the same calculation and never have been, and which he had spent most of his adult life conflating without realizing it. He had managed the grief after Margaret with money. He had hired enough people and purchased enough things and built enough walls that the actual grief had been almost manageable, contained, navigable right up until the moment Elsie stopped speaking and money turned out to have no purchase on that particular problem at all. He had thought, for 2 years, that he was doing everything a father could do. And he had been doing everything a wealthy father could do, which turned out to be a significantly smaller category. Thought about this for a while. Then he put the account books away and went to find Nora. She was in the parlor, which surprised him. Nora rarely used the front rooms of the house, maintaining by habit the distinction between the family spaces and the working spaces that nobody had actually required of her in months. But she was there tonight, sitting by the window in the chair Margaret had liked, with the quilt on her lap and the lamp at her elbow, and a quality of someone who had ended up somewhere without quite planning to. Quilt was almost done. He could see that now. It had grown over the months she'd been at the ranch, grown with the particular organic logic of something being built piece by piece without a blueprint, and now it was large enough to cover a bed. Sewn together from the pieces she'd brought with her Caleb's work shirt, the kitchen curtain, the faded blue of Elsie's dress and pieces that had been added since, including, he noticed, a square of brown wool that looked familiar. He sat down across from her. "Is that your coat?" she said. "The one with the torn pocket that Mrs. Aldridge was going to throw away. I asked her to give me the piece instead." He looked at it. A square of his coat, sewn in next to a square of Caleb Bellamy's work shirt, which should have been strange and wasn't. "The warehouse," Nora said, not looking up from the stitching. "There's talk about what it should become." "Arthur Lyle mentioned something," Gideon said. A permanent shelter," she said, "for families who need it. Not charity work, food, a place to stay that isn't the back room of a church hall." She paused. "He came to me about it. He came to you. He said I was the right person to help design how it would actually work." She looked up. "He's right. But I'm not the right person to fund it, or to have it named after me, or to be the figure it's organized around." Gideon thought about this. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying it needs to be a community thing," she said. "Not a Rourke charity. Not something the wealthy man does for the poor people, with the wealthy man in charge of deciding who deserves what." She held his eyes. "I've been on the receiving end of that kind of help. It takes something from you, even when it's given honestly. It makes you smaller." He was quiet. "If you fund part of it," she said, "and the merchants fund part of it, the ranchers and the settlement workers, and if it belongs to everyone, then nobody has to feel smaller to use it. Nobody has to perform gratitude to a single person." "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since the second week in the warehouse," she said. "When Helena Marsh came in and worked 6 hours and didn't tell anyone she was coming." She looked at the quilt. "It wasn't my plan that made that possible. Or yours. It was the crisis. And crises end. The question is whether you can build something that works without the crisis to force it." He thought about the account books in his office, the numbers he'd been sitting with all afternoon. "I can contribute," he said carefully, "the fund. I can put in a significant initial amount enough to establish it properly. But it can't be named after me, and I can't control it. No, she agreed. Merchants. Ranchers. The settlement workers Reese, if he'll do it. Widows. She looked up. Someone who knows what it's like to actually need it, he said. On the board. With a real vote. The corner of her mouth moved. Gideon Rourke, suggesting that widows get a vote. Specifically this one, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Something passed across her face, not the almost smile this time, something less guarded than that, something that had been staying behind a careful door for a long time and was now standing at the threshold deciding. That's not nothing, she said quietly. No, he said. It's not. He went to Horace Vane the following week. He went alone. In the morning, without announcement, the way Vane had come to him with the bourbon in September, and he sat across from the man in his office above the feed merchant and let the preliminary silence establish itself before he spoke. I want to talk about the relief fund, he said. Vane's expression was careful. He had been careful since the warehouse, since the storm, since Cecilia had come home and apparently told him enough of the Chwat scene that the conversation at their supper table had, by all accounts, Walt's cousin had relayed, been a difficult one. The public position Vane had maintained since was a masterpiece of strategic ambiguity, neither endorsing what Gideon had done nor attacking it, which was itself a retreat from his previous certainty. I heard there's talk about formalizing something, Vane said. There is, Gideon said, and I want you on the board. Vane blinked. He had not expected that. Not as the chair, Gideon said. Arthur Lyle is going to chair it if he'll accept. But I want you on it. You know this town's finances better than anyone I'd otherwise ask. And he paused. This was the harder part. And because you're going to be more honest about the limitations than someone who only wants to feel good about it. Vane was quiet for a moment. He was a man who understood being offered something and understood the shape of what was being offered here and had enough intelligence to recognize that the shape was genuine. The Bellamy woman, he said. Nora, Gideon said. Vane's jaw worked slightly. Nora. She'll be involved. She'll be on the board, Gideon said. Yes. Another silence. Gideon let it run. He had learned from a specific woman that you could sit in silence without being frightened of it. You know what people are still saying, Vane said. Yes, Gideon said. I do, and I've decided to stop managing that and start doing what I think is right and let the town catch up or not. Vane looked at him. Something in the look was assessing, and something else in it was not quite respect. Not yet. But something's in that direction. When Cecilia came home from the warehouse, Vane said slowly, she told me. He stopped. His jaw moved again. She said the Benedetti children were in there. She knows the Benedetti family. The wife buys from the church lady's table. He looked at his desk. She said when she went in, the children were with your daughter, sitting against the wall. Gideon said nothing. Elsie Vane said, using the name deliberately this time. Cecilia said she was just sitting with them, like it was natural. She has a way with children, Gideon said. Vane nodded slowly, the nod of a man working through something in real time. I'll consider the board, he said. I'm not saying yes. I want to see the structure first. That's fair, Gideon said, stood to leave. At the door he stopped, not quite turning around. Horace, what you said on the street that day about removing her. He kept his voice even. I don't need an apology for it, but I want you to know I remember it. And I think on some level, you do too. He left before Vane could respond. November settled into December with the particular cold that Wyoming territory delivered as a reminder of its actual nature. The ranch work resumed its normal rhythms, the winter routines that were less dramatic than the spring, and fall but more relentless, the daily management of animals and fences and water that didn't stop because the weather was bad or because you had just spent 2 weeks in a crisis. Gideon worked. He had always been better at difficult periods than at comfortable ones, which was both a strength and something he suspected Nora would eventually have something to say about. She did, in fact, have something to say about it. It was a Saturday evening, 3 weeks after the warehouse had been emptied and returned to its ordinary purpose, or almost ordinary. The raised floors were still there. Still, as Nora had asked, untouched. They were at supper, the three of them, plus Mrs. Aldridge, who had begun eating with them on weekend evenings in the easy, unannounced way that arrangements shift when the people involved stop performing formality for each other. Elsie was talking. She talked at suppers now, with the tentative but real consistency of someone who had discovered that the mechanism worked and was cautiously expanding its use. She was telling a story about the bean garden, which had produced its first full harvest in October before the frost, a harvest she had apparently managed with Nora's assistance while Gideon was occupied with warehouse logistics, and which she now described in detail, including which plants had been productive and which had failed, and her theory delivered seriously about why. Mrs. Aldridge was listening with the expression of a woman who had waited 7 years for this child to talk about beans at the supper table and was not going to do anything to disturb it. Nora caught Gideon's eye across the table. She made a small, specific movement of her head not toward Elsie, but toward him, the kind of look that said, "Are you hearing this in the language of two people who have been through enough together to have developed a shorthand?" He looked at his daughter, who was explaining the structural difference between the plants that got morning sun versus afternoon sun, and felt the thing in his chest that had no correct name, the thing that was neither grief nor its opposite, but something that occupied the same territory, something that understood loss and still somehow arrived at this. After supper, after Elsie was in bed, they sat on the back porch the way they did most evenings now, regardless of the cold, because neither of them had established this as a habit, explicitly, and neither of them had stopped doing it. "The relief fund is moving forward," he said. "I know. Lyle told me. Vane is going to join the board." She turned to look at him. "Is he?" "He said he wants to see the structure." Which means yes. She thought about this. That's actually significant. "I know." Cecilia saw Elsie with the Benedetti children. He paused. "I think there are things that get past the arguments people make for themselves. You can tell someone something is wrong until the words wear out. But sometimes they see something that does it instead." Quiet for a moment. "You went to him?" "Yes." "You didn't have to do that." "No," he said, "I wanted to." She looked at him. In the dark, in the cold, with the ranch quiet around them, and the stars doing their indifferent work overhead, she looked at him with that particular quality. She had the one that didn't let things be comfortable lies, that required whatever was actually true to eventually be present. "Gideon," she said. "I know," he said. "I don't think you do," she said. "Because if you did, you would have said it by now." He was quiet. The cold had a clean quality to it tonight, the kind that clarified rather than dulled. He could hear the horses in the far paddock, shifting and breathing. He could hear the wind in the cottonwoods along the ridge. "I've been afraid," he said finally, "that anything I said would sound like it was because of the situation, because of what we went through, that you'd hear it and think this man is confusing something temporary for something real." "And is it temporary?" she said. "No," he said. "It is absolutely not temporary. It was not temporary in July, and it was not temporary in August, and it was not temporary in the warehouse, and it is not temporary now." He turned to look at her, but I didn't know how to say that in a way that was about you and not about everything else. She held his gaze. "It's about you," he said. "The way you walked across that street, the condition you set, the way you talked to Elsie, the way you sat with Rosa Benedetti, the way you sew things back together from what's left." He looked away for a moment. "The way you told me I was scared, and you were right, and you didn't use it against me." The porch was quiet. "I'm not going to say I knew it from the start," Nora said. "That would be a cleaner story than what actually happened." "I don't want a clean story," he said. "Good," she said. "Because what actually happened is that I trusted you slowly, and I argued with you, and there were days I thought about leaving because I was afraid of what staying meant." She paused. "But I didn't leave." "No," he said. "You didn't." "That means something," she said. "Yes," he said. "It does." A long pause, full of things that were not quite said yet, but were close. "I'm not Margaret," she said, not as a warning, just as a truth she felt needed to be on the table. "I know who you are," he said. She looked at him for another long moment. "And I'm not Caleb," he said. "No," she said. "You're not. But I'm asking you to stay," he said, "not as Elsie's caretaker, not as any arrangement with conditions and wages and anything that keeps a door open you don't actually want kept open." He held her eyes. "I'm asking you to stay because this is yours too if you want it. This house, this family, this difficult, complicated, expensive, occasionally disastrous life." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Is that a proposal?" she said. "It's an honest one," he said. She looked at the dark ranch yard, the barn, the cottonwoods, the cold November sky. I need you to understand something, she said. If I say yes, I mean it permanently. I'm not someone who does things halfway, and I'm not someone who can be managed or redirected when it's convenient. You saw who I am in the worst conditions. That person doesn't go away when the crisis does. I'm counting on it, he said. And Elsie asked me last week, he said, whether you were going to be her mother. Nora went very still. I told her I didn't know yet, he said. She told me I should ask you, and that I should do it soon because winter was coming, and she didn't want to have to keep wondering. He paused. Her exact words were just ask her already, which suggests she has more of Margaret in her than I realized. The not quite laugh again. Fuller this time. She said that, Nora said. She did. She looked at him for a long moment. He let her look. He'd learned that. The patience of someone who had stopped being afraid of what honest silence might contain. Yes, she said. One word. But a new one, or an old one used for the first time in the way it was meant. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat on the porch in the November cold until the temperature finally drove them inside, and neither of them felt any need to make it larger than it was, because it was already exactly as large as it needed to be. The board for the Copper Hollow Community Relief Fund held its first meeting in December in the back room of Arthur Lyle's dry goods store, which was warm and smelled of spice and old wood and had enough chairs if you didn't mind them being mismatched. 9 people around that table, Lyle at the head, Gideon to his right, Nora to his left, Thomas Reese, who had come in from the settlement with the specific gravity of a man who understood that being asked to sit at a table where decisions were made was not something to take lightly. The merchant Albright, who had come around with the hesitant integrity of a man who had done a private accounting of his recent behavior and found it wanting. Helena Marshach, who had worked 6 hours in the warehouse and told no one and was here now with the quiet determination of someone who had made a decision about herself. 2 ranchers who had known Gideon for 20 years. And, at the far end, Horace Vane, who sat with his hands flat on the table and said very little for most of the meeting, and, when he did speak, said things that were precise and useful and indicate he had thought carefully about the structure before coming. The meeting lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, they had a founding document, a funding commitment, a structure for decision-making that required agreement across the full board before any significant choice was made, and an operating principle written by Nora, revised by Reese, accepted by everyone that said, no person receiving assistance from this fund will be required to demonstrate worthiness, provide collateral, or surrender their dignity in exchange for help. Vane had been the one to suggest adding the word dignity to that sentence. Nobody made a ceremony of it. Lyle moved on to the next item on the list. But Gideon across the table caught Nora's eye. She gave him a look that said, I saw that. He gave her one back that said, I know. Christmas came, and with it a snow that Elsie received with the particular delight of a child who had spent enough time in interior silence to find the world's external events genuinely interesting again. She stood at the parlor window on Christmas morning and watched the snow fall on the ranch yard, with her hands pressed against the glass, and then she turned around and said, to the room in general, it looks like the quilt. Gideon looked up from where he was adding wood to the fire. Nora, coming through from the kitchen with a towel over her shoulder, stopped. They both looked at Elsie. She pointed at the window. All the different white. It's not all the same. Some is old and some is new. Like the quilt. She looked at the quilt on the chair, Nora's quilt, finished now and used, draped over the chair where Margaret used to sit. All different things that fit together. She turned back to the window, apparently satisfied with this observation, and went back to watching the snow. Gideon looked at Nora. Nora looked at the quilt. She crossed the room and picked it up and brought it to the window and settled it around Elsie's shoulders, and Elsie leaned back against her without looking away from the yard. And the 3 of them were at the window for a while with the snow coming down outside and the fire behind them and the ranch quiet under its white layer. Mrs. Aldridge came in to say breakfast was ready. She stopped in the doorway, looked at the 3 of them at the window. She went back to the kitchen without saying anything. Laderschwit's windows were dark. She would sister in a letter that it was the closest thing to whole she had seen the Rourke house look since before Margaret died. Most of its windows were dark. She would cross that out and write it again and leave it in because she couldn't think of a more accurate way to say it. January brought the first real test of the relief fund. A family named Carver, 3 children, a father who had broken his hand in a fence accident in November and hadn't fully recovered, a mother who was doing the work of 2 people and losing ground, came to Lyles and Forrester and asked about the fund with the specific mixture of need and humiliation that comes from having to ask for help in a small town where everyone knows your name. Lyle called Nora. Nora went to the Carver house. She spent 2 hours there, and when she came back, she had a clear picture of what the family actually needed, which was different from what they'd asked for, which was different, again, from what they thought they were allowed to want. She brought it to the board. The board deliberated for 40 minutes and approved food assistance, temporary wage support for a settlement worker willing to help with the Carver fence work at a fair wage paid from the fund, and a provision that the assistance would continue for 3 months without review, which was Reese's addition and which passed unanimously. The Carver family did not have to come and demonstrate their worthiness. They did not have to thank Gideon Rourke publicly. They received what the fund provided, and they went home and they kept their dignity, which was the most expensive thing the fund offered and the one that cost it the least. Gideon heard about it from Lyle afterward and sat with it for a while at his desk. He thought about the conversation where Nora had told him she'd had enough of being someone else's story. He thought about the way she'd set a condition before she'd accept anything wages, not charity, and how he had understood it intellectually at the time and understood it differently. Now, most of its windows were dark, having watched to a person when the terms were set right, when the help came without the diminishment. He thought about what it had cost him. The food stores, the timber, the Henderson deal, the social repair that was ongoing and would be for a long time. He thought about the account books and the numbers he'd been sitting with in November, and he thought, there is no version of the past year in which I would trade any of it. Not the warehouse, not the storm, not the 4 hours in the rain with Reese and the settlement workers, not Elsie's voice saying, just ask her already, not Nora's hand in his on the November porch, not any of it. He was not a man given to large internal declarations. He did not traffic in the language of transformation or revelation. He was a practical man who had done a practical accounting and arrived at a practical conclusion. Conclusion was this: he had spent 41 years building things that were his alone. His land, his empire, his carefully managed life. And all of it, the wealth, the position, the reputation, the walls he'd built with such patient architecture, all of it had been insufficient to the one thing that actually required him. To his daughter in her silence. To the woman who had walked across that street and refused to be made invisible. To the families in the settlement who had needed somewhere to put their sick children in October. Money was useful. He had never been naive enough to think it wasn't. But it was a tool, and like all tools, its value was determined entirely by what you built with it. He had been building the wrong things. He was building different things now. He pulled out the account books and opened them, and started the February projections, which were more optimistic than November's had been. The railroad workers had brought their business to his supply operation with a loyalty that hadn't existed before. The merchants who had wavered were coming back with the specific reliability of people who had seen something and been moved by it, and 2 new ranching families had come to him with business proposals that had nothing to do with his social standing and everything to do with his demonstrated judgment. The empire was not just surviving. It was rebuilding on different foundations, the way things rebuild after a storm not identical to what was there before, but potentially more solid, rooted in ground that had been tested. He worked through the numbers with the satisfaction of a man who understands that the work is not finished and will not be finished, and that this is in fact exactly as it should be. The quilt on the parlor chair had pieces of all of them in it, old cloth and new, loss and what came after. A work shirt and a curtain and a child's dress and the wool from a coat with a torn pocket, all of it stitched into something that kept a person warm. Nora had made it from what was left. That, Gideon thought, was exactly what she had done with all of it. And outside, in the January cold, the ranch went about its ordinary, extraordinary business of being alive. The wedding was set for the second Saturday of April, which gave Copper Hollow's winter enough time to exhaust itself, and gave Gideon enough time to finish the fence sections that had been deferred since October, and gave Nora enough time to talk herself out. of being nervous about it approximately 40 times. She was nervous anyway. Not about Gideon. Not about Elsie, who had received the formal announcement delivered by Gideon at the breakfast table, with the careful gravity of a man who understood the stakes with a look of such elaborate unsurprise that Nora had to press her lips together to keep from laughing. Not about the life, the ranch, the difficult, complicated, expensive, occasionally disastrous arrangement she had said yes to on a November porch. She was nervous about the ceremony itself in the specific way of a woman who had been married before and knew that weddings were not the hard part. Weddings were the easy part. The hard part was every ordinary Tuesday afterward, when the feeling of the wedding had faded and you were left with just the person and whoever you actually were together when nobody was watching. She had done the hard part. She knew what it looked like. She wasn't afraid of it. But standing in front of Copper Hollow, the town that had crossed to the other sidewalk to avoid her, that had let Horace Vane announce on a public street that she should be removed, that had drawn a boundary line around sick children in October tents, standing in front of all of that and asking it to witness something she actually cared about, felt like a different kind of exposure than anything she had managed so far. She said this to Mrs. Aldridge on the Thursday before, in the kitchen, which was where they had most of their real conversations. Mrs. Aldridge listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was characteristic of her, and then she said, "They're not the same town they were in July." "Some of them are," Nora said. "Some of them are, Mrs." Aldridge agreed. "And they're going to be there, too. And that's all right. You don't need everyone to have changed. You just need to know which parts of the room to look at." Nora thought about this. "Look at Elsie," Mrs. Aldridge said. "When you're nervous, just find Elsie." The morning of the wedding was cold, in the way April mornings in Wyoming are cold, not the sheer cold of winter, but the provisional cold of a season that hasn't fully committed yet, sharp enough to make breath visible and soft enough to suggest that warmth was coming, and meant it this time. Gideon stood at the window of his bedroom at 7 in the morning and looked at the yard and the ridge beyond it and the sky that was doing its best impression of something that intended to behave. Most of its windows were dark. Walt Briggs knocked on the door at 7:30, and the expression of a man who had been working for Gideon for 12 years and had opinions about the occasion that he was managing with professionalism. "You look like you're calculating something," Walt said. "I'm not," Gideon said. "Good," Walt said. "Stop." Gideon took the coffee. "The seating arrangements are handled," Walt said. "Lyle's people did it yesterday. The ranch hands have the chairs set up in the front yard. Mrs. Aldridge has the food situation. The Reese family arrived this morning from the settlement, and Thomas Reese is already talking to your foreman about something involving cattle, which I assume you'll want to know about later and not right now. And Elsie, Walt said, has been dressed since 5:30 and is currently in the kitchen eating biscuits and telling Mrs. Aldridge in significant detail about the correct way to arrange wildflowers, which Mrs. Aldridge is accepting with her usual grace." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Walt," he said. "Yes, thank you, for the warehouse. For October. For all of it." Walt looked at him with the specific discomfort of a man thanked directly for something he considers to have been simply what a person does. "Well," he said. Then, after a pause, "She's good for you." "That's all I know," Gideon said. Walt left him to finish his coffee in peace. They were married at 10 o'clock in the front yard of the Rourke Ranch, under a sky that delivered on its morning promise and opened into something clear and pale blue and wide enough to make the whole territory feel momentarily generous. 63 people came. Gideon had not counted on 63. He had counted on perhaps 40. The people he knew would come without social calculation being required of them. But 63 arrived, and among them were faces that required him to revise his accounting of what the previous 9 months had accomplished. The Benedetti widow, Rosa, came with her 2 older children and a younger woman who served as translator, and who spent the ceremony leaning over and whispering things in Rosa's ear that made Rosa nod with the satisfied expression of someone receiving confirmed information. 3 families from the settlement came, including Reese, whose wife was a small, fierce Welsh woman named Mare, who shook Nora's hand before the ceremony with the grip of someone communicating respect through the palm of the hand because the words weren't quite available. Helena Marsh came alone. As she had gone to the warehouse, without announcement, and stood near the back and watched with the expression of a woman who had made some adjustments in her understanding of the world and was still working through the implications. The 17-year-old from the grocer's came with his mother, and he stood very straight the way young men stand at events they want to be taken seriously at, and he watched Elsie walk up aisle ahead of Nora with the specific expression of a boy who is approximately 15 months from understanding what that expression means. Gideon noticed this and filed it for much later. Horace Vane came. He came with Cecilia, and they sat in the fourth row, and he did not look comfortable, which Gideon had not expected him to. Comfort was not the point. The point was that he had come, had chosen to come, had decided that this was a thing that his presence should acknowledge. Cecilia Vane sat beside him with her hands in her lap and watched Nora walk across the yard with the specific expression of a woman who is in the process of updating a long-held opinion and finding the update more complicated than the original. Arthur Lyle sat in the front row and beamed with the uncomplicated joy of a 62-year-old man who has decided that beaming at weddings is one of the few uncomplicated pleasures remaining to him and intends to exercise it fully. And Elsie walked ahead of Nora with a small bunch of wildflowers that she had arranged herself, wearing a dress that was pale green and too long at the hem, which she had insisted on, and which nobody had fought her on, and she walked with the particular gravity of a child performing an important function and aware of it. Most of its windows were dark. When she reached her place and turned to watch Nora come forward, she found her father's eyes in the crowd, and held them for a moment with an expression that was so Margaret it made Gideon's breath catch. Then she looked at Nora coming across the yard, and she smiled. It was a full smile, unreserved, the kind that used her whole face, not the careful, measuring expressions she usually wore, but something open and certain and entirely without qualification. The 63 people watching may have thought Elsie was smiling because it was a wedding. Gideon knew better. She was smiling because she had known how this would go since July, since a dusty Tuesday afternoon when she had walked across a public street, because something in her had understood what the rest of them were still catching up to. She was smiling because she had been right, and because being right about something important is one of the better feelings available to a person. He looked at Nora. She was looking at Elsie, and whatever nervousness had been with her that morning, the 40 times she talked herself out, the specific exposure of asking this town to witness something real was gone from her face. In its place was the expression Mrs. Aldridge had told her to find, Elsie looking back. Gideon took her hand when she reached him. Her hand was cold from the April air. He held it the way you hold something you have learned the specific value of. The ceremony was brief because they had both agreed that ceremonies should be briefer than people usually made them. The words that mattered were the ones said between two people in the ordinary course of a life, and not the ones performed in front of an audience. They said what was required. They meant it completely. When it was finished, and the small crowd made the sounds that small crowds make, Elsie pushed between them from behind and put one arm around Nora's waist and one around Gideon's and held on to both of them at once with the proprietary confidence of a child who has decided something belongs to her and intends to keep it. Gideon put his hand on the back of her head. Nora put her arm around her shoulders, and they stood there, the three of them, in the April morning, in front of 63 people and one wide Wyoming sky, and that was that. What followed the wedding was not a grand alteration. Lives don't work that way, and anyone who had been paying attention to the previous 9 months would have understood that the Rourke household had already done most of its transforming in less ceremonial circumstances in kitchen conversations before dawn, in a garden the size of a tablecloth, in 4 hours of rain and timber in October. What changed was subtler than transformation. It was more like settlement, the way things settle when they've been placed correctly and allowed to find their own weight. Nora moved her few possessions from the back room near the stairs to the bedroom she now shared with Gideon, which she did practically and without drama, and which resulted in her small wooden box of sewing materials occupying the corner of his room that had previously held a lamp he didn't use, and the quilt appearing on the bed where it remained, because they had both independently decided it should. Elsie began calling her Mama. Not immediately, not the day of the wedding or the week after. It happened on a Tuesday morning in May. 6 weeks later, with no announcement, Elsie came into the kitchen where Nora was standing at the stove and said, "Mama, the beans are up," as though it were the most natural sentence in the world, and then looked at the pot Nora was tending and said, "Is that oatmeal?" with the specific disappointment of a child who was hoping for something else. Nora stood at the stove for a moment without turning around. Then she said, "It's oatmeal, but there are biscuits if you want them instead." Elsie took a biscuit and went back outside to her beans. Nora stood at the stove until she was certain her face was under control, and then she went to find Gideon. She found him in the yard, and she told him, and he stood there in the May morning and looked at the ridge for a long moment, and when he looked back his face had the particular quality of a man who is not going to say the thing he's feeling, because it's too large for the available language, but who needs the person across from him to know that he feels it. She knew. She put her hand on his arm briefly, the way you touch someone when words would make it smaller, and then she went back to the kitchen because the oatmeal was going to burn. Copper Hollow Community Relief Fund had its first full year of operation, through 1882, and the accounting of that year kept by Lyle with the meticulous care of a man who understood that transparency was the thing that kept community institutions alive. Past their first good intentions, showed 23 families assisted, 9 temporary shelter arrangements, 14 work placements, and 1 situation involving a widow with 3 children and a flooded claim that had required the kind of creative problem, solving across the full board that took 2 meetings and a site visit to resolve. The board met monthly in Lyle's back room with mismatched chairs and coffee that was never quite hot enough, and the particular productive friction of 9 people who did not all agree on everything and were not expected to. Vane was difficult in the specific way that useful people are difficult. He pushed back on expenditures with a rigor that initially read as obstruction and eventually revealed itself as the thing that kept the fund from overcommitting in its first year and running dry before spring. Rees pushed in the opposite direction with equal force, arguing for the human cost of what delays meant in practical terms, and the two of them had developed, by November of that year, the grudging working relationship of people who have discovered that their opposite instincts produce better outcomes together than either would alone. Nora had engineered this, not overtly. She hadn't sat them next to each other and told them to work it out. She had simply, in the first 3 meetings, asked each of them questions that required them to respond to each other's points directly rather than to the room in general, and the rest had followed from there. Gideon watched her do this from across the table and said nothing about it until afterward in the wagon on the way home. "You did that deliberately," he said. "Did what?" she said, in the tone of someone who knows exactly what. "Vane and Reese," he said. She looked at the road ahead. "Someone has to keep the money honest, and someone has to keep the people honest. Those two understand their jobs. They just needed to understand each other. You could have told me that's what you were doing. You would have told me it wouldn't work," she said. He considered arguing with this, and did not, because she was right. Question of the warehouse had been sitting unresolved since October, since the day Nora had asked him to leave the raised floors in place, and he had agreed without knowing why she'd asked. By the following spring, it had become clear what it was for. The relief fund had been managing temporary shelter arrangements by placing families with other households, which worked and was imperfect in the ways that all solutions requiring the goodwill of third parties are imperfect. What was needed was a dedicated space somewhere families could go without having to be someone else's problem in someone else's house. Gideon proposed the warehouse at the April board meeting, not donated structured. Formal arrangement and was with the warehouse served the fund's shelter operations at a nominal cost that went toward its maintenance, which meant it remained his property and his responsibility, but served a community function, which meant neither the fund nor the families using it were beholden to his charity. Nora had helped him work out the language. The board approved it unanimously, including Vane, who read the structure carefully and said it was defensible, which in Vane's vocabulary was high praise. The raised walkways from the October storm stayed in place. They served as the framework for a sleeping platform when families needed to stay. The cattle pen timber, dismantled in a rainstorm to save 31 lives, had ended up becoming the structure that saved a different kind of lives. Afterward, not from fever, but from the slower emergency of having nowhere to go. Rosa Benedetti, who had learned enough English by the following spring to conduct basic conversations with the determined efficiency of a woman who had decided the language barrier was an inconvenience rather than a limit, told Nora at the 1-year anniversary of the relief fund that her husband would have liked what was in that warehouse. He was practical, Rosa said. He liked things that worked. It works, Nora said. Yes, Rosa said, because of the right people. Elsie turned 9 in the summer of 1882 and 10 the following summer, and the girl who had spent 2 years in silence became, with the particular deliberate pace that characterized everything she did, a child who spoke her mind with a clarity that teachers would later describe as remarkable, and that Gideon, being her father, would describe as occasionally inconvenient and always impressive. She had opinions about the bean garden, the quilt, the correct temperature for bath water, the settlement children's education, and the quality of the storytelling in the dime novels she was not supposed to be reading, and absolutely was. She had strong opinions about fairness, developed with the precision of a child who had watched adults negotiate fairness for 2 years, and had formed conclusions about how it was and wasn't done. At 10 years old, she informed Gideon over breakfast that the settlement children didn't have a real school, and that this was a problem and that someone should address it. He looked at her over his coffee cup. Is that so? There are 14 children in the settlement between 6 and 12, she said, counted. The ones who have any schooling got it in whatever town they came from. The younger ones don't have any. And you think someone should? I think I should teach them, she said in the afternoons. I know enough. Gideon looked at Nora across the table. Nora was eating her breakfast with the expression of a woman who had known this conversation was coming and had decided to let it develop on its own. You're 10, Gideon said. I know that, Elsie said. But I know reading and arithmetic, and I know them better than they know nothing, is what they currently have. He opened his mouth, closed it. She's not wrong, Nora said without looking up from her plate. He looked at his 10-year-old daughter, who looked back at him with Margaret's eyes and the particular expression of someone who has made a decision and is waiting for the adults to catch up. Where, he said. The warehouse, Elsie said. Afternoons. It's empty then. He thought about the raised floors from the October storm. About 14 settlement children sitting on them in the afternoon light. 2 afternoons a week to start, he said. And you tell me honestly if it's too much. It won't be too much, she said. Tell me honestly anyway, he said. She considered this. Honestly, she said. It was as close to a promise as Elsie made, which meant it was ironclad. She started the following Monday with 7 children, which became 11 by the 3rd week as word moved through the settlement with the efficiency of word in small communities. By spring, she had 14, which was all of them, and she had persuaded Thomas Reese's wife, Mare, who turned out to have more formal educations than she had ever mentioned, to take the older ones for arithmetic on Fridays, while Elsie handled reading with the younger group. The afternoon's school in the warehouse ran for 2 years under this arrangement, before the question of a proper schoolhouse became unavoidable. Most of its windows were dark, at which point the Relief Fund Board took up the matter with the specific productive disagreement that had become its operating style, and the schoolhouse was built, and the discussion of who should teach in it was brief, because there was only one person anyone actually considered. Elsie's windows were dark. Elsie was 12 years old, and Gideon said she was too young, and Nora said she was ready, and Lyle said the children already thought of her as their teacher, and Reese said the settlement families would not send their children to anyone else. And Gideon sat with this information for 3 days and then said all right. She was the youngest schoolmistress Copper Hollow had ever had, which was not saying much since Copper Hollow had not had a schoolmistress before, and she taught with the particular combination of seriousness and unexpected warmth that people who had watched her develop were not surprised by, and people who were meeting her for the first time found quietly astonishing. She was not a perfect teacher. She was impatient with children who didn't try, and occasionally too demanding of children who were trying as hard as they could. And she had to be told by Nora more than once the same thing Nora had told Gideon years earlier about watching too hard and needing too much back. She got better. Not perfect. Better. There is a thing that happens in small towns when the story changes not all at once, not dramatically, but in the accumulation of small revisions until the old story is simply no longer the one that fits. Copper Hollow changed this way. The town that had crossed streets to avoid a widow in patched clothes became, slowly and imperfectly, and with backsliding and occasional reversions to its previous instincts, a town that pointed to the relief fund as a source of pride, that sent children to a school where settlement kids sat next to ranch kids, and nobody thought to question it, that had a warehouse with open doors that people used without surrendering anything to use it. Not everyone changed. That would be the clean version, and the clean version would be a lie. There were still people who thought the relief fund was charity dressed up in language, who thought the settlement workers should stay in the settlement, who thought Gideon Rourke had let himself be managed by a clever widow and would eventually see it. These people existed. They always will, in every town and every era. The people for whom the way things were is a comfort that no amount of evidence about the way things could be will displace. Nora had no interest in those people, which was different from not caring about the damage they could do. Cared about that. She spent energy managing it in the quiet way. She managed most things with patience and directness and the refusal to be baited into reactions that would give them something to point at. But she didn't need them to change. She had learned something in the years since Tuesday and Jusamai, something that had clarified slowly the way things clarify when you live them rather than observe them. The change that mattered was not the change in the people who had already decided. It was the change in the people who were still deciding. The 17-year-old from the grocer's, who was 19 now, and had started carrying food deliveries to the warehouse without being asked. The young wife of one of Gideon's newer ranch hands, who had come to town knowing no one and found her way to the afternoon school through Elsie, and who now brought her daughter every Tuesday and Thursday, and had, without any particular ceremony, become someone Nora counted as a friend. These were the ones, not the dramatic conversions, quiet ones. It was Gideon who had the harder reckoning, and it came later than Nora's, in the particular way that men who have spent their certainty meet their reckoning slowly, and often through the side door. He had understood, in the warehouse, in the storm, that he had been building things wrong. He had understood it in the November accounting. He had understood it in the board meeting and in the conversation with Vane and in every Tuesday on afterward, when the ranch operated on foundations that were different from the ones he'd built it on originally. But understanding is not the same as sitting with the weight of what you missed. The weight came to him in the spring of 1883, almost 2 years after the Tuesday on Main Street, on an evening when he was going through papers in his office and found the folder of Nora's original wage records, the ones from the first weeks, before everything had changed, when she was his daughter's caretaker, with conditions and wages, and a line between them that both of them had observed. He sat with that folder for a long time. He thought about the women who had bought mending work from Nora through Mrs. Caldwell, and then quietly arranged other means. He thought about the bruise on her wrist, and the parasol, and the story she'd told him with the particular flatness of someone who had learned to compress humiliation into a manageable report. He thought about what Copper Hollow had done with a woman who had done nothing wrong except run out of luck at the wrong time. And he thought, I walked past that store. For months, I walked past her on Main Street and made the calculation that she was not my business and kept walking. Elsie had known better. He put the folder down. He was not a man who tended toward regret as a general practice. Regret without action was a kind of self-indulgence he had always regarded impatiently. But there was a version of reckoning that was not regret and not self-indulgence, but something more like honest accounting, the kind where you look at what you did and what it cost other people, and you hold that cost clearly so that you don't put it down somewhere convenient and forget it. He held it. He thought about the families in the settlement, about the line the town council had drawn, about the wagon full of food he had sent out once, early in his years in Copper Hollow, to a family he'd heard was struggling, and how he'd felt good about that for a week, and then filed it in the category of things adequately addressed and moved on. How many families between that one and the Carvers had he filed in that category? How many times had the calculation been, this is not my problem, and how many of those calculations had been wrong? He couldn't recover those, couldn't know the number. What he could do was what he was doing. What he could do was keep doing it. He put the folder away. He went to find his wife. Nora was in the parlor with the lamp and the quilt, which was a scene he had walked into hundreds of times by now, and which never failed to produce in him the specific feeling of a man who understands that a thing is his without having expected that it would be. She was not sewing tonight. The quilt was across her lap, and she was looking at it. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She looked up. "Caleb," she said, not with the flinching quality that used to sometimes accompany his name. Just plainly. "I was thinking that he would have liked the school. He was the one who thought education was. He had strong feelings about it." "Tell me," Gideon said. She looked at him. He didn't ask her about Caleb often, not because he resented the man, but because he hadn't known how to ask in a way that was about her rather than about his own discomfort with the question. She talked about Caleb for a while, the things he had believed about what was possible for people if they had access to what they needed, the way he had died before any of it came to anything, the specific grief of watching someone leave before they had gotten to be who they were going to be. Gideon listened. When she was done, she looked at the quilt. "He's in here," she said. "The brown square there. His work shirt." She touched it. "And your coat pocket piece is right next to it." She looked up. "I thought that might feel strange, and it doesn't." "No," he said. "I'm not sure I understand why." "Because a life isn't one thing," he said. "Pieces. You said that when you were making it." She looked at him. "You remember that?" "I remember everything you've said to me," he said. "More than you'd think." She folded the quilt in her lap. "That's either very romantic or slightly alarming." "Probably both," he said. She almost laughed. The full laugh that he had learned was not given easily, and was therefore, each time it arrived, something worth the patience it had taken to earn. The years that followed were not stories with clean endings, because lives don't have those either. There were hard years and better years, and years that were simply the grinding work of maintaining things that mattered. The relief fund had difficult seasons and board disagreements that were not always productive. Most of its windows were dark. The school had years when the student numbers dropped because settlement families moved with the railroad work and came back, and years when Elsie had students who were harder to reach than the 7-year-old girl she'd once been and who reminded her, in the specific uncomfortable way, that mirrors remind people of things, of her own silence. Gideon's cattle empire had lean years and profitable years, and one bad year involving disease in the North herd that set them back significantly and required the kind of retrenchment that meant real sacrifice rather than the financial flexibility he had operated in before. He got through it the way you get through hard years when you've built something on real foundations, not without damage, but without collapse. He and Nora fought, not often, but genuinely when they did, with the specific edge of two people who are both certain about things and have learned to say so. The fights were almost always about something specific, were almost always resolved through the application of the same honesty that had defined them from the beginning, and left them afterward with a particular respect of people who have argued with each other in good faith, and come out knowing each other more accurately. He was not always easy to live with. She had told him this, and she was right. He had a tendency to work through difficulty by working harder rather than by processing the difficulty, which was functional as a coping mechanism and exhausting as a domestic pattern. She had a tendency to hold things longer than was useful before she said them, which came from years of managing herself carefully, and which meant that sometimes things arrived in conversations that had been sitting in her for weeks. They were, in other words, two people, not a love story, a life. On a Sunday afternoon in the autumn of 1885, 4 years after a 7-year-old girl had walked across a dusty street and changed everything, Copper Hollow held a small ceremony to mark the 4th year of the relief fund. It was held in the yard beside the warehouse, which had been operating as a shelter and school annex continuously since the previous spring. Lyle organized it with the low-key competence he brought to everything, and the speeches were mercifully brief, and the food was good, and the attendance was the kind of genuine rather than obligatory attendance that tells you something real about what a thing has meant to people. Gideon was asked to speak. He stood up in front of perhaps 80 people ranchers and merchants and settlement families and the board and people he didn't know well who had apparently been following what happened in Copper Hollow with some interest, and he thought about what he wanted to say. He had prepared remarks. He had written them out, revised them, practiced them the way he practiced important things. They were good remarks. They were accurate. He put them in his pocket. 4 years ago, he said, my daughter crossed a street to hold on to a woman this town had decided to ignore. I was standing right there. I almost stopped her. The yard was very quiet. I don't say that to make myself look worse than I was, he said. I say it because I think most of you know exactly what that calculation feels like. The one where you decide that something is not your business, where the cost of paying attention seems higher than the cost of walking past. He looked at Nora, who was standing at the side of the yard with Elsie beside her, watching him. I've been trying, for 4 years, to understand what changed, he said. I thought for a while that it was the fever, or the warehouse, or the things that happened that were big enough to force a different calculation. But I don't think that's it anymore. He paused. I think it was a 7-year-old girl who didn't have a word for everything she understood but understood it anyway. And a woman who had every reason to be diminished by what this town did to her and refused, absolutely refused to be. He looked at Elsie. She was 14 now, standing straight and serious with her arms at her sides, and her mother's quilt around her shoulders, because the autumn afternoon had turned cold, and Nora had put it on her 20 minutes ago when she thought no one was looking. School, he said, the fund. The warehouse, with open doors. None of it started with a plan. It started with someone seeing a person who was being made invisible and deciding that was not acceptable. He looked at the crowd. I would encourage all of you to figure out, in your own life, what that looks like. Not a ceremony, not a speech. Just the next time you're standing on the sidewalk and you're about to walk past something your gut is telling you matters. Stop and ask yourself what your daughter would do. He sat down. Lyle started the applause, but it spread genuinely, which was different. Nora caught his eye across the yard. She gave him the look that meant, I saw that. He gave her one back that meant, I know. Quilt hung in the Rourke family home for the rest of their lives. Not displayed, hung. The difference between the two is the difference between a thing preserved and a thing used, and the quilt was used. Washed. Repaired in places. 2 more squares added over the years, their origins known only to Nora, stitched in during evenings when the house was quiet and the lamp was lit and the ranch outside was going about its ordinary work. The brown work shirt square, the kitchen curtain, the faded blue of a child's dress, coat pocket, and the others, the ones that came later, each of them a piece of something that had been lost and something that had been found, and the acknowledgement that both were true simultaneously, and that was all right. Elsie grew into a woman who taught 3 generations of Copper Hollow children, and who was, if you asked anyone in the territory who knew her, exactly what her parents were in their own ways, honest, direct, unimpressed by the performance of goodness, and consistently interested in the real version. She never did become easy to manage. Gideon had stopped trying somewhere around her 14th year, and Nora had never tried in the first place. She turned out fine. More than fine. She turned out like someone who had been raised in a house where the doors were open and the people inside were trying, with full awareness of their own imperfection, to do something real. And Copper Hollow, the town that had once crossed streets to avoid a widow in patched clothes, that had drawn boundary lines around sick children, that had seconded motions and sent parasols in the wrong direction. Copper Hollow became the kind of place that had, improbably and incrementally, and with considerable arguing along the way, decided to be something better than it had been. Not perfect, not finished, better. Which is, in the end, the only kind of change that actually lasts, not the sudden, dramatic kind that makes a clean story, but the kind that happens in the accumulation of small choices made by imperfect people who decide, on any given Tuesday, to stop walking past. Gideon Rourke had learned this from his daughter, who had learned it from a woman with a patched blanket and a condition and a refusal to be invisible, who had learned it, perhaps, from the particular combination of loss and stubbornness and the specific human capacity to take what's left and make something from it that was better than what broke. Quilt on the wall, the doors open. The girl who grew up surrounded by people who understood that real strength was not the kind that made you hard enough to break things, but the kind that made you strong enough to hold them. And the little girl who once lived entirely in silence, the one who had known before any of them, who had walked across the street because she could see what they couldn't. She grew up and she taught, and she lived. For as long as anyone in Copper Hollow could remember, exactly the person she had always been, someone who saw what was real, even when it was inconvenient, even when it cost something, even when the whole town was walking the other direction. She got that from her mother, both of them.